12 miles below. By Mark Arrows. Chapter 101 to 110. Book 3, Chapter 10, Dealing with Difficult Neighbors. Absolutely not. Shadow Song said, not even looking up from his desk. I made the mistake of letting you persuade me once before. Did you not see firsthand the results? You were nearly killed. Okay, sure, that looked pretty bad. I placated, but hear me out, we came out of it with a stupid amount of relic armor, so it's hands down a net win. The biggest win in clan history. All because I convinced you to let me go to a dance. Now, I'm not asking for much here. Just to let me go outside, stretch my legs a bit, meet a bunch of suspicious strangers who clearly have duplicitous intentions, maybe come back with a snowball or something. Nothing to it. Shadow Song growled. Actually growled, while he tossed another piece of paper, stamping it with his house's sigil. This is no time for jokes, Winterscar. I'm not joking. He paused, then slowly looked up. Okay, maybe I'm joking a little bit, but I'm also serious. I clarified. The Chosen had reappeared just outside comms range. Telemetry data showed they'd parked their shiny looted airspeeder behind a large mountain, conveniently out of visibility from our railgun turrets. Their terms were pretty simple, they want to negotiate. And they're holding hostage the second airspeeder crew on board with them. So far, so good. That'd be normal. I too would be rather annoyed on hearing the latest news, and holding the airspeeder crew hostage isn't exactly an unjustifiable position. Assuming they really were innocent, which is about as likely as the surface heating up. And then they royally screwed up on their next term, they demanded I come with the negotiations in person. Me. By name, saying they wanted a more neutral party, and for some reason House Winterscar was who they'd picked as neutral. No one else, not from any of the other houses, or houseless. Not a shinobi, and not even a trained negotiator. They were adamant about that. And that was the final death blow for Legis and the Chosen inside the clan. Shadow Song and I had been running in circles trying to pin that pipe weasel on something, and in the end it's his own knights who fuck it all up for him. Ironic. Convincing the clan lord was simple after that. First the slavers came looking for me. And now the Chosen are doing the same? They made it way too obvious. Now Legis and all his refugees were corralled back into prison and kept under guard, for their own protection, as word of this would surely leak out to the population. They were already on edge with the Chosen, this would be a lit match into the fuel. Lord Drass seemed almost stunned at the start, like she couldn't believe the Undersider Knights would just brashly try to have this work. I caught her muttering about the expected intelligence of Knights, that she shouldn't have expected more from a stranded group alone out in the wastes. Little rude, but I was a reacher at heart. Stereotypes exist everywhere, what can I say? Loyal knight, absolutely. Strong knights, also a good stereotype. Intelligent knights, well, not so common that one. Reachers are least would gossip about what favorite flavor of glue knights like to chew on while they were lifting weights. I don't know what the Logi talked about in the privacy of their quarters, but it likely was somewhat similar. Maybe for the Chosen Knights this didn't sound like an unreasonable demand in a vacuum. The enemy's not omniscient after all, they're bound to make mistakes as much as we are. So naturally, I wanted to go pay these knights a visit and spring their cute little bear trap with an iron boulder. I am not allowing you on this mission. Shadow Song said. Your guards and some of the elites will be coming with me, and I will deal with the Chosen hostages personally. You will sit here, and not go looking for trouble. But there's so much we could discover if we try to spring their trap intentionally. They don't know about our night breakers, the winter blossom techniques, or the occult I can use. Whatever they've come up with, we can put a wrench in it. We don't know the scale of their intelligence. Shadow Song said. They may have gotten word from after the slaver attack on our capabilities. We didn't use any night breakers in the attack. There is no way they could possibly know that exists. If I go as they're asking, we'll get a chance to see why they're after me in the first place. Just knowing which of my secrets got leaked would go a long way to stopping any more flow of info, and it might reveal just how they got so much intel out of the clan. And damn everything, I needed to know why they had gone such a distance to target me specifically. There were gravestones outside that demanded more than the hymns we sang for their burial. I needed to get my answers. There were traitors among our ranks, and I was determined to ferret them out. You will not convince me. Out there, you run a real risk of death. You know any mission to the White Wastes comes with that risk by default. As a scavenger, that risk was once acceptable. It was our duty to the clan. Now, as a knight of rank, and a specialist in the occult, you are far too valuable to risk. No clan has had a sorcerer in our entire history. Look, if we're talking safety, then think about it this way, there's 3 elements to safety. I brought a hand up, and began to count them out on fingers. The first is how many of my guards I'm around. The second is if I'm in armor or not. And the third is if I'm in the clear to use the occult. The rest of the clan's infrastructure isn't going to keep me any more or less safe. I could be in the center of an army of rifles, and it wouldn't do me any good if the enemy attacked with a single knight. Get to the point. You're departing with most of my guards and the elite. The defenses left in the clan are drastically inferior. I'm less safe hanging inside the clan than being surrounded by my men. For all we know, maybe that's exactly what they want. You and all the firepower out there in the freeze far from me, and they'll swing around for round 2. Additionally, out there I'm free to use the occult because nobody's around to see me other than our own knights. From a safety perspective, the safest possible place I can be is on that airspeeder with you. And if I'm already on site, why not make use of me as bait to spring the trap? I've already shared what I know of the occult with the clan lord. I'm no more important than any one of my guards in the grand scheme of things. You're the only one who can use the occult's true powers without your body going limp. None of the other knights are able to override their armor's systems. There is no amount of practice that would change that fact for any of them. You are unique. And that's exactly why I should be out there. I'm the heaviest hitter you have on the roster now. I would be wasted just hanging out here twiddling my thumbs. I see what's happening here, he said, folding his hands together and setting them on the table. You've won one fight against your first real opponents, and now you believe yourself invincible. And what if I am invincible? I shot back. When my armor and I work together, with full access to the occult, I'm on the same level as a deathless. You saw the footage. The slavers were obliterated by my hand. Technically at least. He said nothing, instead, just stared me down. This damn sentimental old man. We both knew my overall contribution to the clan as a reacher had been wrung dry. I was a knight retainer, and for the first time in my life I felt actually proud of that rank. Fine. I didn't want to do this, but you're leaving me no choice. He lifted his head at that. And while the helmet hid his features, I could almost imagine the raised eyebrow. I demand remediation for your earlier attempt at my life. I will consider the debt settled if you allow me to join this expedition. He stayed silent at that, staring at me. I think his jaw might have dropped. You don't mean that? He hissed. You don't know what you're asking for. I fully expect death as a possibility for any of us out there in the wastes. These undersiders all know they have no chance against surface techniques. They'll have prepared other defenses as a counter or take more dangerous measures to the hostages they hold. Whoever is leading them has clearly lost any use for legies or the chosen, given how casually they were tossed aside, so I strongly doubt their ability for mercy. This is not a mission for rebellious teenagers or the brash confidence of youth. This is a mission for level-headed veterans. You are letting your emotions get the better of you, recognize that. Call me brash if you want, that doesn't change facts. If I had been anyone else, some random knight, you would have grabbed me for this mission without a second thought. Cathita and I working together could beat anything, even him. And Shadowsong knew it. The man leaned back in the chair, armored hands letting go of the seal and his pen. "Please," he said, this time his voice turned almost soft. "Reconsider, Keith. I do not wish to see you harmed. You are feeling a battle high, I've seen this in younger knights again and again. Your confidence is better placed than theirs, given the track record. I'll not deny facts. But please, reconsider this. This is new to you, and you're overestimating your reach. That'll be for the clan lord to decide. If we cannot settle the remediations, it will fall to her decision. And like you said before, she's Logie. I'm a net addition to any team I'm put on. We already know what her decision would end up being." I paced around back and forth, before turning back to him. "I'm not some defenseless reacher that needs to be sheltered. And this isn't some need to prove myself again. I see how I can help the clan the most, and this is it. We need to know more about what they've discovered. And the safest place I can be is with you nearby at my side. The two of us can't be beat." He held my gaze for a time, saying nothing. Then, ever so slowly, he gave a resigned nod. "So be it. I accept the remediations. I will adjust the strategy to incorporate your involvement, and pray to the gods we are not making a mistake. Reduce friction coefficient by 20, give me a bit of slack on the slides." Teed flicked on a few switches, calling out to me every so often. "Reducing coefficient by 20, now," I said, entering the commands and verifying the airspeeder followed orders. The frigate did exactly as ordered, all systems showing green. White snow billowed under us, fading fast as the bulk of metal flew above at impressive speed. I could see the antennas on the side rattle in the wind, though the sound didn't carry into the pressurized cabin. He tilted the joysticks to the side, carefully banking the speeder past another hillside, all while keeping the cockpit pointed straight at the target destination. A difficult maneuver, and he made it look effortless. It probably was effortless to him, muscle memory by now. "Looks like we just crossed the 10 mark. Time to suit up, take over the commands for me, kid. Mind the turns, should be straight for a few miles before we get into the potentially dangerous parts," Teed said, twisting on his chair and heading to the side lockers. My hands reached out and grabbed my own set of joysticks, instantly taking command of the vessel. He'd left it on horizon mode for me, which meant the airspeeder stabilized itself mostly but still needed some human input to keep it sharp. It was still a heady feeling, to be at the very front of a few thousand tons of metal speeding away, and being able to turn it with the lightest touches on the joysticks. Teed always set his configurations to minimize the amount of movement his hands needed to do. Slight inches would put the airspeeder in a spiraling twist. Not to mention our frigate moved far faster than standard frigates, as Shadowsong took out a full intercept frigate for this operation, with gauze cannons, missile racks, and all the goodies that come with a war frigate configuration. We'd come with teeth. Teed had somehow passed into the gold rankings over the time I'd been back in the clan, with a simulation score that currently topped the ace pilots by a good margin. In his words, he needed to take a few levels, and fortunately more hours in the sims could directly correlate to a better score with the right training and attention to detail. Where he got the motivation to know life it like this was something only him and the gods knew. Journey helped me keep the sticks perfectly level, so there wasn't any sort of turbulence on the switch. A relic armor could compensate quite well, so even Teed's insanely twitchy controls were manageable. "Start chilling the cabin, I'll have my rebreather on by the time the temperature starts getting nippy," he said, while I flicked the options. Vents started to hiss at the sides, leaking in outside air in controlled bursts. The man sat back down on his own chair, equipping the last of his gear and making sure there was a correct seal on his goggles. "Right. Now they're free to start shooting our ride, and I don't have to worry about the outside air being a decompressive threat. Lovely. Isn't that such a wholesome feeling?" I said. He chuckled. "Not yet. We got to bring all the weapons from yellow to red alert. Make sure if there's a firefight we hit back just as hard. After that I'll feel better. He turned a few more switches, and the cabin lights dimmed, red turning on and illuminating the darker recesses in a blood-washed color. All knights, prepare for first drop. All knights, prepare for first drop. We soared straight over a fissure, and he twisted the airspeeder to zoom parallel to the steep cliffside. He gave the all green, and I could hear the sound of knights jumping off, diving straight into the dark abyss next to us. Teed hadn't even slowed down. The knights could survive a fall like that. And slowing down would alert the enemy something was up. Nice and steady now, he muttered. Got to keep the fat side of this ship to block their pings. Can't let them catch us dropping our teams. The path we'd mapped out would zigzag around, picking a few spots where our knights would tunnel through underground and surround the enemy airship. If anything happens, they weren't getting away anytime soon. Not with the equipment we'd brought. Second drop, incoming T-2. Second drop, T-2. He announced, pushing the airspeeder to glide around another massive spike of ice and metal. Another set of knights, including some of my guards, disembarked off the airspeeder, hitting the ground hard and rolling into a slide. Low to the ground, too obscured by the terrain for active scanning to detect them. Shadowsong entered the cabin now, leaving the door and airlock open behind him. Cold air flowed by him slowly, with the cabin already at temperature now. Status, pilot? He asked. Just about ready to open comms with them, sir. We can drop the last team at Gamma, and then we can slow down and start heading into the mountainside. The main part of the plan was to have multiple night squadrons catch up to the airspeeder on foot, where they weren't going to be detected. Each squad carried one night breaker among them, which should no-sell quite a bit of the opposition. Teed's airship would remain on standby with artillery ready to call down a strike, and he's also the only pilot that can fly through the cracks in that mountain with alacrity. Anyone else would be forced to move at a crawl speed just to avoid crashing into the walls. Which was something the Undersiders likely aren't expecting, considering they picked the center mass to park their airspeeder. They didn't want anyone to come in or out with any speed. Shadowsong nodded to Teed, one hand holding onto the handle behind the pilot's seat. Head focused on the approaching iceberg. Begin phase 2 of the operation. He turned that faceless helmet of his to me next. Open communications. You're up, Winterscar. Book 3, Chapter 11, Talk is cheaper than snow. The Logi bumbled up into the cockpit, clearly uncomfortable in the Eva suite. Teed and I watched him waddle his way over, while Shadowsong remained focused on the white wastes beyond the cockpit window. Greetings, Winterscar. The man said, huffing and puffing his way to a chair inside the room. It made sense for him to have difficulty, everyone started new at some point. It took a few months of wearing these things before anyone gets that ease of movement retainers passively cultivate. And Logis don't usually go out this far onto the surface. The only time most surface dwellers go out, if they aren't scavengers, was to praise the passing gods. And that was only a few feet out of the colony gates in perfectly safe conditions. He sat down slowly, making sure he wasn't crushing any part of his suit's systems. Another mark to the tally. These suits were designed to take some good light-hearted beating. Good enough if you tripped, you didn't need to panic too much about issues. Different story if you get tossed against a wall by an angry machine, of course, but I don't think the engineers who designed the suit had that in consideration. My name is Reginald, of House Cosine. The Logi said, taking a nasally breath in between sentences. I've the pleasure of being selected to assist you in negotiations. I gave him a quick head bow and shook hands, exchanging the traditional greetings. Before we begin, you're familiar with sign language, correct? He asked. My fist raised in the air and I bobbed it back and forth, mimicking a head nod. He signed back, pleased. As expected of a retainer, of course. He gave a few coughs, straightening out his rebreather slightly, and then sat up in the seat. I will be advising you via sign language as to not interrupt your discussion with the Undersider Knights. The objective is to have them peacefully surrender the hostage crew. Intelligence briefing let me know this is likely not going to happen, but an attempt should still be made on assumption it does. I shrugged, glancing over at Teed. He shrugged right back. It's your show, kid, I'm just the ride here. Now, he was interrupted by a beeping noise at his side. A surface timer, with all the big buttons that came with it. A timer tended to be one of the more used tools up here as a scavenger, oddly enough. Everyone knows crowbars are the master tools, but smaller things like this end up being just as important. Sorry, I need to run a check of my suit. The guidelines stated to do so every 30 minutes. Your NI levels are fine, as is the pressure, sitting right at the optimal point, no deviations. Rest of the numbers check out too, no need to worry. I said. How can you tell? He asked, puzzled. Then looked up sharply. Oh, I forget myself. I know your profile. I suppose you know some of the signs to look for by instinct. Some stuff I could guess at with experience. Like the ice forming on your rebreather right there. I poked at a section of his suit. Size of it means you've got everything in line. If it grew to cover the tubes, then you'd know you're in trouble and there's something wrong with the heater. You pick up tricks like that over time. Teed chimed in from his seat, also condensation on the goggles. If it starts to get fogged up in there, that means your vents are covered up, usually snow. But that means snow's probably covering up other things too if it got to the vents. Part of the top 5 doom signs. Interesting. Doom signs. Scavenger jargon. I clarified. There's a couple dozen small rules that you learn over time. You get a feel for things. Some are more important than others, hence the top 5 list. I guess as a knight I'll never have to worry about those things again. Kind of odd to think. I had a lifetime's worth of skills and experience for something I never needed to do again. The Logie hummed. I never read any of that in the guidebooks. Teed laughed. That's 'cause you're going by the books and checking your systems every half hour, like all good scavengers should be doing. You'll never have to worry about doom signs. It's the lazy ones that don't follow the rules that need to rely on doom signs as a shortcut. Somehow, I'm getting the impression you have stopped doing the routine checkups, or following guidelines. Another fist bob from me. Teed didn't even acknowledge that, instead turning around on the chair. Comms systems are warmed up and ready to go, kid. Let me know when I should give them a ring. They know we're here already, they haven't been subtle about their pings. Well, let's not keep them waiting. Is there anything else I need to know before we start? The negotiator shook his head. No. You may begin. I reached a hand out and flicked the comms switch. There was a crackle on the speakers as I spoke into the mic. Undersider Frigate Galstone, come in. This is Keith Winterscar, of Clan Altosk. The static flared up for a moment before the voice of a man came on. Clan Frigate Prowler, we have you on comms and read you, 5x5. It's a little cramped in the cockpit here with the folks, but we're fine. A warm cheery voice even. That was odd. Reginald flickered through a few hand signs, all serious now. Coded messages. 5 enemies spotted. Hostages isolated to cockpit section. Who am I speaking to? I asked, a little puzzled why Undersiders would filter in some of the emergency code words. My answer came back in moments. I am Codrith, House Insight. Pilot, Copper rank. The Undersiders don't know how to handle things beyond steering, so we're being held at gunpoint to operate in their stead. I have a lovely gentleman to my right who's watching me. We're finalizing the comms connection Delta and I'll pass you over to him. More hand signs. Unharmed. Unsure of enemy plans. I could recognize some of those code words. Small things like lovely gentlemen were buzzwords that could be tossed in seemingly innocent conversation but meant different things. That's about all the intel we could get as the voice changed over to someone more gruff. You're the Winterscar. I am. I hear you wanted to talk to me directly. There was silence on the comms for a moment. Sure. Give us a moment to, organize terms. And so? I need to talk to the captain. The comms went dead. Teed spun around on the chair, glancing over at me. Well, that's a new record for you. How'd you manage to piss them off that fast? I had bets going with the gunner for at least a minute before the cussing started. I gave him a light shove on his chair, shutting him up. The negotiator on the other hand was twitching in his chair, thinking. Shadowsong spoke for the first time. Report. He said, looking at the logi. Voice elevated. More filler words than natural. Either this knight is not a good speaker, or was rapidly coming up with things to say on the spot. Given it's a negotiation, they should have prepared ahead of time. Unless they're negotiating in bad faith without anything pre-planned. Something isn't correct. I see. Was all the Prime replied, turning his gaze back to the window. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach at all this, my head rapidly connecting dots. The crew slipped us info they only saw 5 knights aboard. So where are the other 18 knights? Trying to do a counter-surround. The negotiator gave a shrug. The crew could be confined to the airlocked areas. They could have been isolated from the rest of the knights. He didn't sound too convinced, however, more as if arguing for the sake of it. They asked for me specifically. Could they have done that to spook the clan into keeping me locked in? And now we caught them with their suits half on, when I actually did show up. The comms clicked open again, and the Undersider Knight spoke. Make your way on foot into the mountain crevices. We don't have a white tent to place, but we'll get some spare cloth and set up something similar enough. Bring 4 guards and yourself, we'll be waiting. What, we can't discuss over the comms? I asked. I don't know how you clanners deal with truces and negotiations, but Undersiders always negotiate face to face. This is how it's done in civilization. Well. Isn't he polite? Reginald gave me a few hand signs. Technically correct. Biased, part of the majority belief from Undersiders that clans are savages. Has another agenda. Continue attempts to discover. You're asking for a lot of trust here, considering where we stand. I said, why can't we speak over the comms and settle this here? That sounds perfectly reasonable to me. What's all this cloak and dagger scrap shit for anyhow? Silence. I gave a glance at the logi, but he didn't have anything new to give. Look, either you come in person and we talk, or you don't and we'll have to take more drastic actions to recover our people. The voice said. Them's the terms, take it or leave it. Conversation's over. Comms clicked shut. At least the knights knew where the off button was. For a group that wanted Winterscar specifically to come as a neutral party, they sure don't seem to appreciate him any more than us. Teed whistled. I'd almost say they sounded annoyed you came. How'd they get to know you so well already? They skipped a few steps there. I gave Teed a lazy finger, while the logi continued as a professional would. They had no true reasoning to ask you to come in person. He said. When questioned, they flustered. They didn't come up with any excuse and were forced to default. Not a good sign. He shook his head again, thinking. Gloved hands straightening the rebreather again like a nervous tick. Likely they're trying to confirm that you are here in person rather than using a COMM relay to talk from afar. I believe we've heard enough. It is my opinion that these men have no intention of negotiating anything, nor is it likely they even have the authority to do so. We were not speaking with their captain, he would have identified himself. Shadowsong nodded, helmet still looking directly ahead. Where the enemy lay. Confirm your verdict with the clan lord, and have it logged into history that they held no peace. I want full permission to engage with hostile intent to collect their armor for our clan. No, he wasn't staring daggers at the enemy. This was his prey. The Logi nodded, tapping away at the comms and sending his message. If I am to guess, I believe they consider House Winterscar the greatest threat of all the retainer houses, considering the number of knights you now have on retention. It would be strategic to eliminate you and create a power vacuum, he said as he worked. Well, he was right, but for the wrong reasons. Besides House Winterscar's soldiers and some of Shadowsong's people, no one else knew about the occult I could manifest. Something Shadowsong wanted to keep under the wraps until it was absolutely vital. If the clan ever hit a low point on morale, I could be used to bring people back from the brink. So long as we eliminated any enemy that encountered me, we'd keep the advantage of having an occult user a secret for every fight. 5 Undersider Knights were no match for Cathita and I alone, and all of them piled together wouldn't do a dent with both Shadowsong and my own personal knights out on the field. They were about to have a really bad day. A moment later, the negotiator got a message from the clan lord. Orders confirmed, he said. You have the go-ahead to engage up to lethal force at your choice. We will have logged enough evidence to prove peaceful intentions were all tried and exhausted. Happy hunting, First Blade. Good. Shadowsong said. I have been searching for a reason to strip these Undersider scum from the moment I saw them. He shifted his gaze to me. Bring your captain of the guards to speed, Winterscar. He'll be your decoy. Sagrius looked pretty good with a white cape, all things considered. There's a limit to the sorts of cosmetics his armor could generate, since he isn't an administrator. Times like these I realize I'd gotten carried away when designing my new look with Cathita. We'd done things regular armor couldn't do. But from a distance he looked passable enough. And none of these Undersiders had seen me in person anyways. It was out of the question to switch armors, especially since the source of my powers was quite literally inscribed inside Journey both in software and physically on metal. This was the best we could do. He flipped the Crusader longsword around, testing the reach and feel of it before sheathing it back. A fine blade, Master Keith. I am honored to wield it. I patted my own belt, where one of my forged swords lay. You know, I've never had the chance to use one of my own blades in combat with my armor yet. How do they fare? Weight was everything when we lacked armor. The common guard are capable of organizing a viable defense with them. In armor, it's the cross guard changes everything, sir. Enables far more movements and counter options, since no knight has ever seen an occult weapon be locked down. So many new options I still find myself mulling over potential new techniques, mentally playing them in my mind, refining them. On my part, Journey had no issues changing itself to look like a Winterscar knight and did so without complaint. Cathita, on the other hand, complained the whole time. But that cranky old bat's going to be cranky about anything, so it didn't come as much of a surprise. If she were alive, I'd have opted to bribe her with tea and crumpets. And she did confirm it would have worked too. As much as I liked the Crusader blade, and the history behind it, getting to use my own swords has a charm to it. Can't say I'm not excited at the prospect to put this to the test. The captain knocked on his chest, typical omen chasing superstition. I pray that the test be swift and the outcome in our favor. Teed brought us closer to the mountain. And mountain would be a generous term for this landmark, since it didn't go that far up on height. It looked more like massive spikes of ice that were squeezed out of the earth, making all the terrain jagged. Given that the earth was made of metal and had different densities, the ice grew wide in size at some points and short for others. As a result, the whole thing was honeycombed with steep valleys, almost like a maze a few miles in every direction. The clan had logged the whole place and mapped it out in detail. This isn't the usual state of affairs to map things out, they don't keep for very long, so rough quick maps were more common. A few years down the line and the world would have shifted enough to make it obsolete. But this case was special, the ice mountain was exactly that, Ice. Easy to cut, with hundreds of good spots accessible by airspeeders, depending on the size. This was the place we hauled meltwater from by the tons. So it was well mapped in order to find where the best spots were to mine. Likely the reason the knights had picked this spot to camp out at. They probably had their hands on the same map. Not exactly hard to get hands on the ice mines maps, they're not considered clan secrets after all. This is where I'll politely ask that you get the foo. He paused, giving a guilty glance to the looming Shadow Song standing silently behind. Ahem, I mean it's a good time to go outside for a stretch, he said, giving me a quick fist bump into my shoulder pad. Shadow Song turned his head ever so slightly. I've been a member of Clan Lord Atias's retinue for years. I've had the misfortune of working with both Ironreach and Windrunner at the same time. Nothing you say or do could be more unprofessional than them, pilot. The Prime wasn't even looking at Teed by that point, helmet still fixed straight out the window, searching ahead. He'd taken Teed and I knowing each other in stride so far, but now that I consider it further, it's probably something he's used to filtering out. Teed nodded, seemingly mollified, then turned to me. In that case, respectfully, get the fuck off my ship, honorable retainer sir. How dare you kick me out of your ship? I deadpanned back, as per tradition with him. I take full offense and I'll see you court-martialed when we get back. What are you planning on doing in the meantime? Play a game of cards. Planning what bribe I'll use to slip the judgment, of course. On the operation, I'll see if I can find a way up to higher ground. That way I can swoop in from any direction. Save your sorry asses in case you mess up somehow. I gave a critical glance at the surrounding ice, eyebrows raised. The massive spiky ice, that looked more like teeth at the ends. And not the flat molars where Teed could plausibly land the ship. I don't see anything up there that could support a multi-ton frigate like this one. More just pointy ends. A bit further in things went back to normal, just a plateau of ice filled with ridges and cracked passages. Here though? The Undersiders clearly didn't want anyone to have the high ground. And the enemy thinks the same thing, kid. So imagine their surprise finding out that's exactly where I'm going to perch my lovely ship. Find me a good pointy end to wait for the fireworks. Give me a good show while you're down there. Call if you need bigger guns to settle the discussions. Shadow Song grunted at that, breaking out of his usual silence. You claim to keep the airspeeder balanced on the tip of the ice walls, pilot? I haven't heard of that being an option. It seems impossible. With respect, sire, if I tossed you a sword and told you to balance it on the tip of your finger, could you do it? The Prime nodded. Yes. Balance is necessary in combat. Same for me. This ship is my sword, and I know how to wield it like no other. Teed's heavy gloves tapped the side of his head. Reacher pilots don't earn the gold earring lightly. Very well. I leave it to your hands. You were selected for a reason, I have trust the Logis behind that selection knew their numbers. Despite your familiarity with House Winterscar. He stood, turned, and walked out the airlock, rifle in hand. So long as the work is done well, that is all that matters. I gave Teed one last farewell, before making my own way out. Don't you dare bring back any snow on my ship. He snarked. I just had the deck polished. It's not even your frigate, you're just driving it for the day. Acting mighty big for your suit there, techie scum. He gave the side of his head another tap, and signed a smug grin, and then had the door close shut on me. Ice has a way of crunching under the weight of a relic armor. Especially since we didn't bother with the leaving the ship to land on the uneven ground. Instead, we just jumped off the side, down a few feet, directly into the surface. With me were 4 others. Sagrius taking the front, looking like me if you squinted a bit. Shadow Song, myself and 2 others all flanked behind him like escorts. The other teams all had a single nightbreaker to share, while Shadow Song and I both carried one tucked behind our waist. Given the tools and skills this little group had, I'd probably be correct in saying we were literally the most dangerous force walking on the surface currently. Zero compromise was done here. The slavers had wanted me alive, so we knew the knights would also attempt to capture me, which gave us some measure of security to be able to walk in like this. But we weren't going to take chances either. The rest of the night teams were slowly surrounding the place, creeping up and laying low. So long as the ice obscured line of sight, there wasn't much the Undersiders could do to detect armor when it's trying to be sneaky. No messages from any of ours about encountering Undersider knights, nor scouts, or even surveillance tech. They either prepared enough to avoid any detection, or they hadn't prepared at all. Basic objective is to buy additional time for the rest of the assault teams to complete the surround. Shadow Song said as our group crunched through the ice, climbing down occasionally, or leaping over ice boulders in the way. Those teams only need a few more minutes to be in position. We have them in our reach, letting them escape is unacceptable. Primary objective above all is to ensure the hostages remain alive. The final team will be approaching from behind the airspeeder and will handle the hostages. I take it you have a plan for keeping our people alive in between us making a scene and the rearguard doing their thing. He nodded. Regardless of their motives, Undersiders have far less loyalty to any cause. They are infamous for such things. They will choose to protect their own lives over orders, and even abandon their leaders. We'll give them a standing offer they won't dare break in the middle of combat. Not if they wish to live. The site was quickly approaching according to my HUD. Knight armor made what would have been a difficult trek filled with ropes and climbing, about as easy as a stroll in the city. A few more jumps from one cluster of ice to another, and we were nearly there. Flatter ground than normal here, which let me see their stolen airship for the first time. Landed, hugging the side of a cliffside. It looked dormant, and the different metal replacement plates gave it that weathered look. For something that had once been used by pirates, it still seemed sturdy enough. I suppose they would take good care of their ships. Ready blades. Keep them talking until everyone is in position. Shadow Song hissed over the comms. Prepare for contact. Book 3, Chapter 12, Deja Vu. To their credit, they at least made it look like they were trying. Under the looming shape of their stolen airspeeder, 4 knights were shuffling around the uneven ground, working on setting up a few poles where a makeshift tent was being set up. The single most miserable-looking tent I've ever seen. Way too high to the point someone could walk inside upright, and still have headroom above. First bit of wind would knock that down, only reason it was still standing was the geography of the area here. It was even worse on closer look, when I realized it had been made from different perfectly functional habitat tents the knights snatched up aboard the airspeeder. Except that wasn't what habitat tents were made for in the first place, and they certainly didn't connect to one another in any way that would offer a correct temperature seal. Tents were supposed to be squat little square things, made to be low and close to the ground, heavily insulated and easy to warm up by reducing the area that needed to be warmed up. You'd crawl inside, eat and drink on your stomach or on your back if that was the preference, and take a breather in safety. Sponge bath and sleeping were also done the same way. With a bit of practice, it becomes a cozy little shelter from the deadly weather outside. The low profile meant easy storage and heavy wines would be a non-issue. Heavy metal beams would be capable of holding snow pile on, rated up to a few thousand pounds. If the wind did become an issue, you had bigger problems to worry about than the tent being ripped off the ground. The airspeeder you rode on is probably in more trouble. The Undersiders clearly didn't get that memo, since they tried slicing a few different tents together in order to make a larger version I'd seen in old pictures from the Third Era. So the exact opposite of what the standard habitat tents were made for, and it wouldn't even work well since all the insulation was cut into pieces just to stitch them together in this unholy abomination. The scavenger inside me was outright seething at the waste of perfectly good habitat tents. Those aren't cheap to make, Ariagel is a temperamental process. But the newfound knight I'd become was more in control, so I let this slide. We didn't try to hide our approach. No, that was the job for the other team slowly sulking around the Undersiders. "We've arrived," Shadowsong said over the public comms, as our group marched up to the makeshift abomination. One knight stepped out, glancing at the assembled crew. Noticing we all had weapons drawn out, Shadowsong stared him down, as if daring the knight to ask us to put down our weapons. The knight seemed to think for a moment, before shaking his head, and motioning us inside. He didn't look armed, rifle stowed away behind his back, while his knife was still firmly inside the boot holster. Instead, he had a rope with a triple-pronged hook at the end tied to his waist and no other equipment I could spot. Zagreus, my decoy, stood firm. Hands folding across his chest, head tilted to the side. He did not look impressed by the events here. I supplied the voice. "I think we can speak out here, in the open." The Undersider looked over at us for a moment, looked back inside the tent, and then paused. Likely speaking on private comms to his compatriots. A few moments passed, before the other Undersider knights shuffled out. "Fine, doesn't make that much difference to us," one said. If they were miffed that their hobbled-together abomination was going to go unused, they didn't voice it. Altogether, there were only the original 4 we were alerted to on our approach. No weapons out, and their gear all looked to be made for scaling walls rather than preparing for a fight. "Who speaks for you?" I asked, keeping still while Zagreus shuffled around as if he were the one talking from the front. They glanced at one another, before one stepped forward. "The captain's away right now. We've been authorized to negotiate in his stead." "Away right now? And what's he doing, taking a piss out in the freeze somewhere? Where's he hiding it? Where's the rest of your group? You're the Winterscar, right?" he said instead, ignoring the questions. Zagreus shrugged while I spoke through the comms. "That's me. Why are you all after me? What's the goal here?" The knight shrugged back. "Golden tits if I know. I just do what they ask. Maybe you're unlucky and got his attention, or you pissed him off at some point. Can't say because I don't know. Do you understand the situation you're in? If I'm here standing before you, whatever plan you've got isn't good enough. We know you're not really here to negotiate, we've come prepared for a fight armed to the teeth, and you will not win this." The knight nodded as if that was obvious to him. He raised a finger. "For one, it's not my plan, so I don't have much of a foot in if it works or not. Frankly, I kind of hope it doesn't, if only because I don't like the bastard any more than you will. For two, we know. This sort of harebrained stunt sounded stupid to us too, but our boss doesn't care if we live or die. Making up a solid working plan is beneath him apparently. But let me guess, you've got us surrounded and probably have a few war frigates hiding around with all kinds of weapons pointed at our heads that we don't know about. Maybe you knew what kind of active scanning our frigate can do, and brought just the right counter to sneak an army around. Or you've got a clan missile ready to blow up everything. That's what I'd do in your boots. How close am I? You sound over your head here," I said, getting a feeling I might have a better hook with some diplomacy. "Work with me and we can find a way to keep you living through the day. Release the hostages, give up your armors, and we'll have you back home eating something warm. Trust us, buddy, this isn't the first time we've found ourselves over our heads. Goddess fuck us up the arse, we've been getting the shit end of this deal ever since we left the city. If you make it out alive too, good for you. For the rest of us..." He looked behind him, to the other 4 who looked back. "We just want to live to tomorrow and we'll figure out what to do then if we make it. Nothing personal, just following orders." "You're not. Save your breath," he said, cutting me off. The rest of the Undersiders were already taking out their ropes and hooks, like a message had just come on their comms. "Between you and me, Winterscar, I think you made the right choice coming here. No one out here to get caught in the crossfire like back at your clan. It would have been a slaughter of civilians. But you did piss him off by making him run here, and now, well, he's here. Hope you do get the bastard, but I don't hold out much odds for that. A tremor shook the ground. The enemy knights looked at one another and then crouched down low to the ground. I had a feeling that I'd seen this before. A wave happened, lifting up the center of the area up a few feet, and then spreading back out in a ring around. And the center caved in, a wide abyss growing as the ice broke apart and fell. There was no escape. Not for me, nor the guards around, or even the undersiders before us. They were also swallowed up by the fall. The second time I've fallen down a hole. Nestled deep within the embrace of the soul fractal, I didn't feel a sense of panic, or even that gut-clenching rush of adrenaline at the start of a fall. My footing slipped as the ground crumbled to pieces under me, and down I went with the rest of the ice. Relic armor is impressively durable against falls. So long as the velocity isn't enough to squash your brain against the skull, any fall could be survivable. Not something people think of often, except I've been in that situation and I've seen someone live through this before. With all the ice chunks falling around, I could grab onto them and jump straight back up in order to reduce the fall speed right before hitting ground. That same thought seemed to have flowed through all of us. Shadowsong was already grappling with a large chunk by his side, leaping from rock to rock until he had a more clear sight up. So were the rest of my guards. I joined in, pushing against the falling debris and clearing my way upwards. Aim for the walls. Shadowsong spoke over the comms. We'll scale back up. Physics of course would make jumping out of the sinkhole impossible, even jumping from rock to rock with relic armor. The Undersider Knights had already tossed out their rope and grappling hooks, striking the far ends of the hole, where they raced through the air, landing feet first against the newly made cliffside. They swiftly worked on climbing and would reach the lip of the surface first, but that didn't worry me. We'd be behind them slightly, which would amount to no difference in terms of combat. 5 of us against 4 of them, and we had the Winter Blossom techniques in addition to better occult weapons. If this was the extent of their plan, they'd seriously messed up. A blue haze began to glow in the air around me, slowing down my fall and causing me to remain floating in midair. Turning around on myself, I could see the rest of us were also being caught in separate beams of blue. I'd seen this before. The first time I've entered a machine nest. 3 types of monsters lurked there. Spiders with 6 legs, ruthlessly hunting me down. Barnacle-like turrets, stationary with only one glowing eye to target with. And a third type I hadn't been able to see in detail. Those would catch and hold prey for the turrets to shred. Rifles out! I screamed. Open fire on whatever source of the blue beams are holding onto you. That was as far as I could get before something slammed into the cliffside to my side. A massive wave of occult blue, like an arc, crushed into the wall. The power rippled into the rockside, causing more of it to crumble down, exposing what looked to be part of the underpass. A wide cavern leading deeper underground. Rifle shots rang out, and I saw my guards were already freeing themselves from the blue beams. Turrets were firing out at them, but their shields were still holding firm. They dropped down further, down into the depths, surrounded by spots of white that were no doubt the machine spiders. I took out my own rifle and began to search for whatever machine was keeping me hovering in the air. I never got the chance to open fire on the thing. Another wave of occult blue slapped into me, batting me out of the beam and sending me flying off, directly into the open tunnel. I landed on solid ground, feet landing correctly only for a moment before the rest of the physical forces threw me into a spin onto the ground. Journey and I slid further into the open tunnel, until finally all speed had bled out in scrapes and sparks. What the fuck was that? I muttered, standing back up. I could hear distant sounds of fighting, deeper underground. Journey's got records of a visual match. It's seen something like this before. Cathita said. You won't like the answer. I don't like the answer either. Tell me. Back underground, on your escape attempt. Rat shit. Run now, swearing later dearie. Cathita said, a real note of worry in her voice. I started a full sprint, racing back to the tunnel opening where I could jump down and land among my retinue. Never got that chance. A shadow leaped up and landed right at the center of the tunnel mouth. The man landed hard on his heels, bending down slowly with the impact before standing back to his full height. The cracked ground by the bare feet clearly pointed to a much heavier weight than a regular human of that size should be it. The spear he carried lit bright Akil blue. He turned with a lazy gaze, back to the opening of the tunnel, and struck the weapon in an arc through the air. Another crescent of power flew out following his motion, hitting the roof of the tunnel and collapsing. Rocks and ice tumbled and covered the entrance, turning the world dark except for the dim glow of the underpass and Journey's headlights. Violet glowing eyes turned in the dim darkness. More steps brought him further into the light. No mistaking who that was. The black shoulder cape. The floating metal halo. A massive shoulder pauldron, more like a flat shield held by his shoulder. And that spear, held in the claw-like disassembled hand of floating metal. You are a nuisance. Tuekar said. It's you. How impressive, you have working eyes and some semblance of memory. Yes, it's me. He all but hissed. It all clicked together. The slavers. The chosen. They hadn't come after me because I'd known about the occult or had created cutting-edge discoveries. There had never been a secret leak. The only thing this feather was after is the golden sphere. No, that didn't make sense. He didn't need me for that. The sphere was in possession of Atius, hidden away somewhere in the clan. What are you really after? I asked. Why go all this way just to catch me out alone? Sometimes, insects simply get squashed for being at the wrong place and time. He shrugged. You spoke with Tsiyua. Anyone who speaks with her is hunted down. The pale lady is a jealous sort, if you haven't already noticed. She'll rip out whatever happened in that bunker and dispose of you after. He took further steps into the light, lifting his spear to the side with a dim chime as the tip brushed the metal ground. Now are you going to come with me quietly, or are you going to make a fuss about it? How did you even single me out? Clearly all the metal on my body is too much for your tiny head to wrap around. Let me help you out, I'm a machine, little human. No detail is too insignificant to me. Acquiring a picture of you was oh so difficult, given how often you pranced around your little hive. Did you think I wouldn't notice the dozens of missing decorations? Did you think that you could hide among your rank and file from my eyes? In my defense, I had no idea I was dealing with a machine at the time. The feather laughed. I don't accept any defense, least of all ignorance. Although it is understandable coming from your kind. I drew out my blade. If you think you are going to take me down easily, you've got another thing coming. One eyebrow quirked on that smug face of his. Really now? I was created to hunt down and kill deities. What hope do you have? Guess we'll find out. I shot back. Inside, fractals lit to life. I hadn't mastered the other spells Atius had left behind for me, but I'd still inscribed them just in case. Time to learn on the job. Cathita. I hissed through the comms. Take over. For this, we'll need to hit him hard right at the start with everything we have. Don't let him adapt. Journey's returning some very low odds of success, dearie. I think we should run. And if I'm suggesting that, you know it's bad. We'll be fine. I said, confident in our chances. With the Winterbloom technique, some of the clan's better knights were able to beat Lord Atius himself in a fight. Atius went neck to neck with this scraphead and held his ground. That said, I did have a motto about fair fights. We have a trump card on our belt. If all else fails, I'd like to see him deal with that. I sank further into the soul fractal, letting go of my body before she could answer back. Occult senses rippled out, concepts growing around with more clarity. When my senses reached Tuekar, I was struck with how much of him was, well, machine. Artificial musculature, gold wiring, a composite skin of some kind, and hundreds of different electric systems all interwoven together. Most of the engineering concepts within the android were so far above my comprehension they only gave out a vague sense of the purpose. The only part of him that felt dead was his right arm, which just stopped being an arm. Despite having everything inside looking together. The spear on the other hand grew into focus and I realized it was filled with circuitry. Something's off with the shaft of his spear. I hissed to Catheta. I knew there had to be more to his weapon. Spears were for mantelpieces and decorations. No one brings one out in a serious fight unless they've come up with a counter to main weak point. You don't say. She snarked back, drawing out the Winterscar swords. I'm old, not stupid. I'm not going to be surprised if that metal pole can suddenly block an occult blade. Not going to take the chance on trying to wrestle that out of his hands either. That's bait on a teacup. Tuekar took another casual step forward, blade lit as he held the spear in his left hand with a casual flick. It seems you still wish to play. Futility is something your kind are well known for, after all. Fine then. Come at me with the best that you have. You'll need it. Catheta drew into stance, but not any I recognized. Tuekar stopped in his tracks, head tilted. The large halo above him floated by slowly in response. Oh my, is that the stance of an imperial imperator? He gave a grin. That's your best plan? Your hidden ace? I suppose they would be rather rare and exotic to you surface humans. I've killed hundreds of them. Cheap little snacks. They're quick enough to make an entertaining fight at least, for humans. Catheta spoke. Out loud into the air, elderly wobble and all. My dear, whoever said you'd be fighting a human? She leaped forward before he could answer, at the maximum possible speed a relic armor could move at. We were a blur in the air, with one occult blade scything through at our side, directly for the surprised Feather's throat. Book 3, Chapter 13, Tackling Apex Predators. The strike was clean and quick, the sort of perfect swing that would stun a courtyard into silence. Tuekar took a casual step back, letting the blade flash a hairbreadth away from his throat. The spear in his left hand spun, already putting itself in position to tackle the follow-up hits. The shock on his face faded to a grin, almost as if he'd been playing it up for dramatic effect. That scrap shit had something else coming for him if he thought that's all we had. A cold pulsed and both Catheta and I struck as one from opposite ends. One side was her blade, and the other was my spectral copy. The spear flicked out, expertly stopping her strike, while he crouched and twisted under my attack, turning the move into a kick that sent us flying backwards, as if we'd run headfirst into a wall and bounced back hard. Catheta landed like a cat, back on 2 feet. Tuekar remained where he'd stood as if nothing had happened, lowering his bare foot back onto the ground. I see Atias found a way to teach you some tricks. A novel use of a relic armor. Very novel. I'm impressed. He smiled. Not often I see something new these days. But this won't work either. Do you know why you won't win? You talk too much. Catheta said while she leaped forward. A cold blue licked the sides of my armor as I readied the fractal of mirrors one more time. The Winterscar blade whistled through the air, a near blur. 3 ghostly blades struck at the same time, from alternate directions. Tuekar matched our speed, and then exceeded it. I think the spear struck back at Catheta's attack, bouncing her off, but I can't be sure. He did something that spun the spear around in his hand, but only the afterimage was what I could remember. Things were going too fast for me to keep up, even with the occult sight feeding concepts directly into my mind. Whatever happened in those fragments of seconds, Tuekar dodged or destroyed all my own occult strikes and somehow struck us hard enough to cause shields to flare up and the armor to groan down onto a knee. Then kicked us away, casually, like we were just scrap metal in the way. Okay. I may have officially bitten off more than I could chew here. Catheta landed hard against the ground, rolling for a moment before her hand struck out and lifted the entire armor off the ground and back on solid footing. Her blades were back up, aimed at the enemy before us. I told you already, human. You cannot win against me. I am a machine. I can overclock my systems. Make time fly by as if it was trapped in amber. He said, taking another relaxed step to follow us, as Catheda reluctantly matched his steps backwards, keeping spacing between us. A second to you can be an eternity in my world. Your armor could attempt to match me, of course. A pale, sloppy imitation. My body was made to funnel and dissipate heat. Made for war and battle, optimized for it, perfected. Your armor has to deal with that squishy human inside. It was built to protect you first after all, everything else is secondary. It could never reach the speeds that I can without hurting you. And they were never created to have such strain put on them, they lack the means to handle that strain for long. You will burn long before you even reach close to my level. He's right. Catheda said in my ear. I know I'm better than him, the little scraphead only has one hand and a spear bigger than his ego. But skill's worth nothing if he can just move faster to counter anything I do. If I try to keep up, Journey's saying I'd risk cooking you alive, dearie. The armor's worse than an overprotective parent, but having you burned to death is something I can grudgingly set my differences aside for. How long can you match his speed? Journey doesn't want to even try. Catheda said. Goddess, it's a pain in the ass and doesn't want to take risks. You're going to have to do that administration mumbo jumbo to make it listen. Tuekar leisurely walked forward. Catheda took steps backwards, keeping out of range. We were going deeper into the cave with each step. Like a weasel playing with a rat trapped in a one-way pipe. I spoke the authorization, Catheda walking me through whichever it was that Journey needed, and only then did my relic armor reluctantly supply the specs it had to work with. The answer wasn't good. The speed problem isn't ever going away, there's a physical limit on how fast I can move the armor without breaking your bones, and the bastard doesn't have that. But we can work around it. The real problem is that heat stays trapped inside the armor for a good few minutes due to the seal against the environment. Even with the overclocks turned off, you'll still be roasting in here with whatever's slowly going away. Journey says 20 seconds is the cut-off point where you'll live through the cool down. 37 if you take off your helmet right after to make an opening for air to pass through. 20 seconds is enough. I said. If he doesn't have a shield, all we need is a few good cuts to put him out of commission. It only takes a second to cut his head off with an occult blade. We aren't making aerogel. And how exactly are you planning on deleting his shield from the equation? Because that seems to be the hard part in all this. You know I can hear you muttering under your helmet. Tuekar said as he continued to force us to backtrack. I have no helmet, but somehow I have the impression you didn't hear me, despite that. Let me help you with that short attention span, you poor miserable little thing. I was created to hunt down and kill deities. I've crossed blades with the likes of Talon and held the line with my brothers and sisters. Even weakened from madness, he's 1,000 leagues above a human cowering behind his pet armor. Catheda, I said, whispering. Time for Plan B. She instantly sheathed a blade and drew the Nightbreaker out from its holster by the small of my back. The feather paused, head tilting. You think something like a grenade is going to do anything to me? He laughed. Go ahead, fire away. I'm right here. You can't possibly miss. Looks like he thought this was just a regular grenade launcher. I gave a prayer to any god that would hear me, hoping that this scraphead's ego was just wide enough he'd think to tank the shell directly. He seemed like the type to do that. Catheda didn't spit on an open gift, drawing and aiming the weapon without hesitation. Goddess, piss on your corpse, scraphead. She hissed and fired. The occult shell launched with little recoil, the payload zipping through the air directly at the feather's center mass. Tuekar's left hand moved. The spear blurred. One moment it had been at his side, the next, it was pointing up, held high in the air, with only the afterimage of the glowing path the occult edge had passed by. He'd cut the shell in half. Right on the way. There was even a whip-like crack as the spear clearly passed the speed of sound to do that. Almost at the same exact moment, physics gave his dramatic counter the middle finger. The shell continued moving forward by inertia, no longer connected as a single unit, but split in half, and still going the same general direction with the rotational energy pushing them apart, but not quite fast enough. Parts of the carefully crafted occult chains inside were no doubt cut, but not all of them, and not all completely. The split shell fragments collided against his bare chest, and the chains flew out as designed. One didn't light up at all, the power source likely being in the way of the occult spear. But the other 3 did light up. 2 had been greatly shortened, and the third was undamaged. They sliced and diced wildly in all directions for a fraction of a second, before the 2 shell fragments flew off in different directions, dragging the chains behind them. The chains hadn't wrapped around their target as intended. But the damage had still gone through in those milliseconds of contact. If he tried to get out of the way, he was already too late. A cold pulsed across his body for a moment, but the chains already reached him before anything could manifest from whatever last-second defense he'd attempted. His shield flared out within that millisecond, and instantly collapsed. The wild chains dug and cut into the mechanical body, causing havoc, ripping apart bits. His limp right arm was shredded in 3 parts, with only the chunk up to his elbow remaining. Dangling from a bit of artificial skin where the occult chain hadn't happened to pass through. His chest had major cuts, right through whatever served as the rib cage. A few chains had both cut into him, and then flailed around before being sucked away by the shell pieces, and they'd done untold damage within him. A shorter chain had whipped right into his eye, and passed throughout his cheek, just before the ear. Nothing survived wherever the occult edge passed. The left arm was mostly intact, but his spear wasn't. Only the spear blade itself had an occult edge. The handle and shaft were the traditional weak point of a spear, the reason spears weren't reliable in combat. Those chains flew right at the shaft, and wrapped around the hilt, where an occult shield, of all things, flared up for a heartbeat. It collapsed just as fast as the feather's own shields had. There was no stopping the chains. The spear was cut into chunks, as if it hadn't been shielded at all, leaving him holding onto a short metal rod with no blade attached. The chains zipped around further into the air, like 2 scribbles of blue fading out, before the shells hit the walls and bounced off, clinking onto the ground. The currents stopped and the attack completely spent. But damn, did this little beauty pay off. Worth every bit of stress and money to make. The moment I'm back home, I'm ordering 10 more. Tuekar stumbled, falling down onto one knee, now looking more like a ripped-up puppet. He lifted his head to stare. Disfigured, with only his left eye working while the right side of his face looked like it had been held down against a blender. A few emotions passed through whatever parts of his face remained working. Shock. Disbelief. Anger. And hate. A lot of hate. And then surprise again, at the sight of an occult blade zipping right for that last eye. Cathita, being both a foul-mouthed hellion and imperial crusader, had long ago learned never to pass on any opportunity to kick an opponent on the ground. The moment she'd fired the weapon, the grenade launcher had been tossed out of her hands while she sprinted forward, Winterscar blades tipped first, one reaching to impale, while the other swept to catch any dodge attempt. The broken feather's head shifted to the side and the blade passed an inch off target, cutting slightly into his cheek. A cold pulsed across his body for a second time, and this time flashed outwards. Cathita's follow-up attempt to cleave down with her offhand went directly through nothing, with the rest of my own occult mirrors also striking through thin air. He'd vanished, but not far. Whatever that occult spell was, it had repositioned him a few feet to our right. Cathita and I instantly pivoted, and we both struck out. I don't know how he did it, but one of his feet kicked the broken spear tip off the ground, and tossed it straight up, directly through one of my occult mirror strikes at the same time that he narrowly avoided Kathita's hit. The ghost apparition faded the moment it was cut through. That didn't matter, I'd thrown out another in that span of time. This second swing he took head-on, letting it cut through parts of his chest, and carve out a new cut across his limp right arm. In exchange he threw out an open-handed punch. A cold pulsed around his arm, and when he struck, it was like a massive anvil had clobbered us. Once more I found my limp body being thrown back violently. "You godless heathen," Kathita snarled, standing us back up a distance away. "Just die already. It's embarrassing. This isn't happening." Tuekar said, voice bewildered. "This can't be happening. How? A12's dead. How did you recover his chain?" "I saw him cast it into the Might Sea, 7 entire levels below, right before we killed him. Nothing comes back from that." "Nothing." He took a step forward and collapsed on another leg. The damage to his chest was really something. A human would have been dead 20 times over by now. It was like watching a corpse move around, the body occasionally refusing to function, twitching even. "No. No, 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 he can't be alive. He's dead. I saw him die." "I don't know what you're babbling about," I said, taking back control. "But it looks to me like you're finished. If you don't want that head of yours to fly off whatever's left of your shoulders, you're going to do the smart thing and surrender now. I've got a lot of questions to ask." He stared back, that one eye seemed as if it wasn't looking at me, but somewhere far off in the past. "Of course," he nearly whispered. "The mites finally spat his body back out. They must have pushed it to the surface of all places. But how did you duplicate his weapon into so many parts?" He turned his head, so that single eye could focus on the broken Nightbreaker round laying around. "Did you hairless monkeys break it apart into pieces? Trying to shake me down for answers, in your state? Bold of you," I said, taking a few steps forward. This time his eye focused on me. It looks like he responded well to taunts. "I see. The situation is not as dire as I'd feared. Analysis makes it clear as day, recently crafted. No marks of anything A12 would have inscribed. Somehow you forged these chains on your own." There was rumbling behind me. The rocks he'd collapsed at the entrance shook, and began to tumble down. "Scans show the fighting's died down on the other side," Kathita said, answering my unworded question. "Our side's breaking the rocks down. Time to wrap him up and take him back home. Part of me really hates to say this, but those Nightbreaker shells of yours are on a different level. Instantly ended that fight. I'd hate to be on the other end of one of those." I in turn aimed my sword at the broken feather. "I recommend giving up now." That violet eye seemed to twitch. "I do not surrender to anyone or anything. I am Tuekar, the one above all challenge and reach. Know this, human. Today, I acknowledge you, weaponsmith." He stood up, slowly, and collapsed back on his knees. "I don't think you're following the script here, buddy," I said. "I've got the sword and shields. You're down an arm, a shield, a spear and," I waved a sword tip in his general direction. "Well, and everything. This fight's over. You're coming with me, or I'll cut you up some more. And then you're coming with me." Man, now I'm starting to sound like the villain here. But there was something visceral satisfying lording over a broken enemy. Or maybe it's the Winterscar in me that simply can't pass up on an opportunity to taunt and kick a downed opponent. "The fight is never over. Not until you, or I, die," he said, oddly calm. "Fine. Don't say I didn't give you a chance. Kathita, serve up another limb. And bring out the fancy silverware please." She complied, one blade swiping down on that last working hand of his. The crippled machine corpse once more moved with that scrap shit alacrity, twisting his whole torso to avoid the blow, grabbing the wrist of our hand, and yanking up. Quite literally, throwing us straight up over his shoulder, in a full unbroken arc, and tossing us away. Like we were a shopping bag. And relic armors weigh quite a lot. In the hundreds of pounds. We hit the ground with a thud, rolling back into ground. No real damage, other than my pride of course, not even the shields were triggered. But how strong was this scraphead exactly? Even with all that damage piled up and no leverage on his knees, he still tossed us like laundry. If I hadn't outright cheated the whole fight with the Nightbreaker, I'm dead certain I'd be machine kibble. The machine corpse tried to rise and take a step after us, but stumbled and crashed down again on his knees. He looked up, aghast. Then his eye widened. "That's, your full name is Keith Winterscar? You?" "Yes, me." "What, you never even checked my first name?" I said, taking some control back and brushing off the dust on the armor. "I'd say I'm hurt, but somehow that seems in character for what I've seen of you. I'll be honest, you're not the most polite person I've met." The feather laughed. "Do you care for the names of each ant you pass by? All humans are the same to me. Or were the same until this moment. I know who you are now. I've just read everything that exists with your name attached to it. Perhaps I was too harsh on my little sister. You are an anomaly among humans. I see now how she could have been killed by you. I don't remember killing your sister. I think that would have been a memorable occasion for me." I shrugged. "Kathita, do you have any idea what he's talking about?" She gave the verbal version of a shrug. "Her name is Tarath. And it was a memorable occasion to her when you killed her. She's very interested in you. Obsessed even. She was named due to your actions. I should have read the full report long ago, there's so much more I could have tormented her with. How I've wasted the opportunities." The rocks continued to rumble, breaking apart. Bits of light shafts began to open up. "Still doesn't jog any memory. Sorry. Don't remember stabbing a machine lady to death recently. I know I have poor memory, but it can't be that bad." He grinned. "A wide wicked thing, like a child that had found a new toy to torment. She wasn't a feather when you met her. No, she came back solely to hunt you down and finish what she started." "Oh. Now I get it. Is this some kind of stalling tactic? You're making up a story on the spot? It's not going to work, but keep going. I'll admit it's entertaining. So what did this lady start exactly? I've got a let's say checkered past when it comes to partners, you see, can't tell if she wants to slap me or ask me for a second date." "Well, I was stalling too on my end." He was immobilized, save for that short-range teleport trick, and I was about to get reinforcements. He had nothing he could do to do damage to me anymore, not with Journey's shield still being active. He could try to punch me a few times and that might just work given his freakish strength. But we had the occult weapons, and he had no shields. The moment we got a cut in, we won, while it would take him some time to punch through relic shields. I also had the overheat trick ready to pull out in case things went wrong somewhere, and given that I'd be only able to use that once, I needed to make sure it would count. It wasn't going to be an end-all be-all solution. The relic armor was still hard-capped on movement speed in order to avoid hurting me with inertia, unlike the feather, but it would put us on a closer playing field for a critical moment. So I decided I was going to wait for the rest of my knights to show up, and we'll dogpile the feather until someone managed to cut his legs and arms off. We'd get him eventually. And more importantly, we had to make sure to get him. Tie him up and haul him back to the clan, then throw as many locks, bolts, and knights as we could to keep him sealed up. Because if there ever were a round 2 against this monster, I'd end up as a smear on a wall somewhere for the mites to deal with. "My dear little sister, she killed that other knight you were with," Tuekar said, with unmistakable glee. "Right before you killed her for that. How ironic. How delightfully ironic." Your final words to her was to remember the moment. And you've forgotten it. Look at your stunned features. You don't even know who she is, do you? I can't wait to tell her. My blood froze as he spoke. Memory flashed through my muddled mind. I took a step back, almost in shock. No. No way. You should feel honored, Keith the weaponsmith. This is the first time I've ever taken an interest in one of your kind. He said. A cold pulsed around him. The next time I see you, I'll be ready. It's a shame you can only die once. Kathida took command, drawing a blade up and lunging out for his shoulder without word. Heat flared inside my suit as Journey overclocked its systems, reaction speeds increasing. The feather simply leered. Madness in that eye. A cold flashed, wrapping around his body in a heartbeat, and faded away right as Kathida's blade struck through. Where he stood, there was nothing left. The fucker had run. Book 3, Chapter 14, Alone. A small part within Tarath felt that this was humiliation unlike anything she had ever experienced before. She was supposed to walk among demigods. And yet, here she was, hiding inside a box in the street like a wounded animal. Using every bit of active mitigation to block relic armor scanning. Curled up, wings fully enclosed, her weight squishing the soft fruits that had originally occupied half of the roomy crate. She hoped the walls would keep the crushed bits of fruit from leaking out. Hoped that the enemy didn't happen to open up the crates around this particular shop front. The war had gone against plan. Somehow the humans had managed to shore up their defense and batter her army away long enough for the pillar to light up again, and she'd been caught in the blast, inside the city, with enemy signals rapidly approaching her location. The first thing she'd done was find a place to hide. None too soon, footsteps and sounds had quickly swamped the area. First civilians returning to gawk or pillage the broken machines. And then the army to establish order and push away the looters. Damage to her system was oddly missing. Things were still responsive, albeit sluggish. The Unity fractal wasn't responding either, as if dormant. Tarath couldn't guess what could possibly interfere with fractal power. That was supposed to be all known laws of physics. No technology could outright mute fractals. And yet the Pale Lady's most powerful weapon had been nullified. How had she survived the blast? No feathers or machines had ever lived through a pillar. The only difference in her shell that she could consider novel for machines was Tennycent. You did this. She hissed at him, in the privacy of her mind. The ghost remained locked deep inside, watching the world through her eyes. There was curiosity coming from him. He hadn't expected her to survive this either. Where is the body? Where is she? Tarath could hear a woman's voice, even muted under her relic armor helmet. That girl had arrived soon after, her heavy relic armor crushing the ground as she landed into the plaza with little care or grace. We haven't found her body yet. A man's voice. A pause. Miss Ambassador? Or should I refer to you as M Lady? My title doesn't matter right now. Where is she? Kedra answered back, nearly snarling. Clinking sounds of armor moving. She must have grabbed him, Tarath suspected. Times like these, the feather was thankful she didn't need to breath. Her shell could remain perfectly still, no heartbeat, no twitches. No secondary bits of information relic armor could pick up on and make guesses for. Oh, only the machine wrecks that came in with her have been found so far. We aren't sure the amount that came in, the pillar might have vaporized some of them even. This is the first time machines have gotten this far into a city before pillars come back online. A man's voice answered. There were footsteps all around the alleyways and areas. She might have crawled into a house and died inside there for all we know, we're still searching. But there isn't a possibility that she'll survive the pillar. Even feathers can't stand against the power of the goddess. Unless I see the body, I will assume she's well alive, and scheming. Kedra said. Find me her body and do not stop searching until you do. There's little point to that, Miss Winterscar. We got here too late, looters were already stripping the power cells. And the feather's body is going to be impossible to find. Look, if looters were fighting each other over simple power cells, all the big wins must have already been scavenged. A feather's body is going to be an exotic thing no one would miss, goddess. I wouldn't even be able to rely on my own men not to turn rogue and try to profit themselves. The value of her corpse is not important to me, Captain. It's the threat she can pose. I want evidence that she's no longer a threat. Your men or the looters can have all the wealth you want. I get what you're scared of, but she's dead. The battle's over. Her body's command's problem to deal with now. They'll find word or an auction for it soon enough and you'll get your evidence then. Kedra's voice took a lower pitch, too low for Tarath to hear. Another pause. Quick footsteps, like someone stumbling backwards. Pushed backwards even. With respect, Miss Winterscar, I'll have to refuse that request. You don't have the authority to set commands to me and my men. You're only a guest from the surface. The man said. Fine. Kedra growled. I will return with a signed order from your commander, if that's what it takes to order common sense. You've seen the footage of my duel with her. I think everyone in the army already has, and many of the citizens too. It's been leaked a few dozen times now. While I respect your combat abilities, that doesn't change the chain of commands. We're not like surface dwellers. Martial might does not mean obedience here. If you think the clans only care about martial might, then you've sorely mistaken my culture. But that's besides the point. You've seen the footage. You know the kind of danger this machine can cause. You need to find her body and make absolutely sure she isn't a threat. I need to see it in person. There's something that Feather has that I want to recover. Everything else, I don't care for. Again, feathers are on a level for the deathless to handle, but there hasn't ever been a record of one surviving the barrier pillars. This one's no different. Panic isn't going to get us anywhere. Footsteps walking away. I'm not panicking. But you should be. If you happen to be wrong on your guess, it will be the city that suffers your lack of judgment. A roar of jet engines, and then nothing but silence and the ever-present footsteps around her. The girl must have gone. What a paranoid bitch. The man muttered. Just as twitchy as everyone said they'd be. Another set of footsteps approached. Another voice, right by the crate she hid inside. Might be a savage, but goddess grant us she's on our side at least. You think she might be right though, Captain? That the feather's still crawling around somewhere? Gold gildings protect us, that sends a shiver down my spine thinking about it. No, the battle's over like I said. We won. Pillars wiped out any machine inside the city, done as done. If feathers could survive through the pillars, they'd have done so before already. Think about it. The feather's dead as shit, and I'm not stupid enough to fuck with the black market. Let them have the body in peace. We lived through the war, I'm not going to get shanked in a back alley because I followed the straight and narrow now of all times and annoyed the smugglers. Are you? There wasn't an answer. Didn't think so. Make it look like we did a search and pack it up. Hours passed inside that crate. But Tarath was a machine, and patience was easy. She heard fireworks at some point. The city was celebrating, noise and clamor all around. Like the beating heart of the city, coming down from adrenaline. Realizing they were safe again for another week. For the most part, once the power cells had been looted from the runners, the rest of the alleys nearby had been closed to traffic while workers were scheduled to clean and break apart the machine shells for parts. Those workers hadn't yet arrived, too busy getting drunk and reveling in the city heart. Night began to fall, according to her internal clock. Mites had set up the artificial sunlight to dim, waxing and waning at periodic intervals. Truly the chaotic misbegotten programs had an affinity for humanity. They helped in just subtle enough ways that Relinquished hadn't seen fit to wage war on them for. That these massive structures were well adapted to host a human city was one such proof. Tarath remained in hiding, despite the silence. She contemplated if she should simply give up on this shell, and attempt again. Tuekar would see it as weakness, but her odds of victory alone here were slim. Slim, but not impossible on further consideration. The pillar would likely be heavily guarded against saboteurs or rogue fringe elements that want to watch the world burn. Could that guard stand against a feather for long? She only needed to break a few parts of the fragile structure, make sure it cannot be fixed, and then have her army grind away the defenses. Under the cover of darkness, only then did she dare lift the top of the box and slowly leave her hiding spot. The city around her was anything but quiet. Noise and celebrations were happening everywhere around, while this street seemed outright empty. Even in the darkness, there were lights and colors everywhere in the city. The base parts of the structures seemed to be might-made. More of that strange false city, except repurposed by the humans to become an actual city. But it was hard to spot the might creations with the human ones. The city had grown around the initial template. Occasionally she'd see walls made of might metal, but more often it was composite wood and cement that outlined the streets. New additions the Undersiders had grafted. Tarath's hand shot out to one of the walls, and with barely a push, she began to scale the sides, leaping from place to place, making light use of her wings to angle herself. She had to keep hidden. To keep the lights on her body dim, even her eyes. Past the first story is where the might creations truly began to disappear entirely. The wood composite took over from there, light enough to be stacked on one another, but durable enough to hold the weight. Further up, she saw far more of the city. Rooftops were a dizzying array of colors, even in the dim twilight of light. She realized why almost immediately. None of the roofs were made with durable material, instead it was all linen tent-like cloth, usually draped in artfully set-up triangular shapes. They fluttered slightly in the calm wind, making the landscape before her look more like a tapestry of a strange multicolored ocean. It seemed almost still, except bits of loose roofing were moving slightly, while the more rigid and well-anchored cloth roofs refused to move against the wind. "What sort of city is this?" she whispered, knocking lightly on the door holding the demon caged. He appeared floating beside her, half materialized. "A typical Undersider city," Tennycent answered with a lazy drawl. "Depending on the architecture of the mites, some cities will look different, but they all share some common features. The tent roofing? Why cloth? Why wouldn't they use a cheap material like cloth? It doesn't rain here. The weather remains constant and tepid. No elemental issues like the freeze to deal with. They have little need to protect their belongings besides for privacy. And they don't wage war inside the cities, that is taboo among their culture. The main reason I've been told, is expansion. They can't build houses outside the walls, so they build upwards or downwards. Cloth roofing is easy to take apart so that another level can be constructed." She looked up and saw he was mostly right. The city looked more like 100 small square spires going up or mixing with one another at different levels. Further up, she saw floating slabs, filled with makeshift zip lines from one another, and the occasional rope ladder leading down. "What are those used for?" she asked. Tennycent shrugged. "I never found out. The times I've visited the insides of a city were few and in between. Always business, and never for long. Surface dwellers are not well seen." Further searching, she found the ultimate target, the pillar that protected the city. It was much further on, at the center of a massive lake. It seemed like the whole city was a crescent-shaped moon around a circular lake, with a long and narrow bridge leading to the center of that lake, where the might pillar stood tall. All around the edge of the crescent shoreline, there were docks of all kinds, with boats moored. Her eyes zoomed through the distance, and she saw racks on racks of fishing gear, nets, and other fishmonger tools. Drying racks, ropes, buoys, it felt like she was looking at something come alive from the historical textbooks she'd read. Humanity hadn't changed at all since. This was also where everyone had gathered. Boats were out on the lake, launching fireworks. People were on the docks, singing, dancing, and screaming. In another life, this would be where Tamery would have been, hawking goods and finding ways to generate profit. Vendors were clearly taking advantage of the crowds to peddle their wares at every shack and cart lined up by the waterside. She'd never make it anywhere near the dock district, not without a disguise. So she turned her attention to looking around for exactly that. Small bridges connected the vertical houses, leaving the streets open to walk, but giving the city a second or even third layout, made of elevated walkways. Some of those walkways were sturdy constructions, others were made with rope and loose boards, clearly a temporary measure that ended up being more permanent than expected. Colorful ribbons stretched out from neighbor to neighbor, with lantern lights of many designs and drawings. They all seemed handcrafted, some expertly made and others clearly constructed by a child. Compared to the stolen memories of the clan colony, this place was massively open and far more filled with color and light. Among the sights, she found what she'd been looking for. A residential sector, noticeable since quite a few of the rooftop canvases held a secret treasure just under it, clothing lines filled with drying items. It seemed every building had a communal spot of some kind, given the amount of clothing she found among the lines. Stealthily, she jumped and glided through the air, always keeping a sharp eye for possible danger. Soon enough she'd scrambled up onto the top, and slipped through the rooftop sheets. The clothing here was scraggly, and clearly of inferior make. But it would do for now. And more importantly, she wouldn't get much more time. The celebrations would end, and the people would return. She snatched a few bits that would cover herself up. Using Tamery and the other chosen as a template, she knew what piece of clothing would go where. A dress and a cloak were all she'd need for now. Something with a hood. It took her some time to find the cloak, but the dress was easy enough to find. Faded blue, but still not completely touching the ground. Her feet would be exposed, specifically the lack of them. She'd only had metal tips, a homage to her previous form. It was outdated. So Tarath forced the nanoswarms within her to graft a look-alike for the moment. Tan pseudo-skin, toes, and digits all. The color mismatched her nearly bleach-white skin tone, so she was forced to modify the coloring for her entire body, all parts that would be possibly seen. Hands, cheeks, nose, mouth. All of it had to be updated into a more natural human hue. The result left her with little power remaining. Enough to continue walking for a few days, but not enough to fight with for more than an hour. She'd need to find a power cell. Her swords would remain hidden in the new dress. "You look passing for a human," Tennycent said to her side, floating by. "You'll need to learn how to mingle as a human among the Undersiders. And you are willing to help?" "For no return." The ghost hummed. "It is amusing. There isn't much else for me to do." Something in his tone made Taratha's hackles stand on edge. The ghost wasn't telling her something, but for now he was the only source of information on human behavior. She would make do with this. Taratha slipped through the rooftop folds, and took a step off the ledge, falling straight down. The cloak became an instant annoyance, blinding her as it rippled around against the wind. But in moments, it came to a stop when her new feet hit the ground with a soft landing. "You're going to need to walk instead of jump around like that," Tennycent said. "We don't fall down a 4-story drop and float to a stop." She hummed an acknowledgement. For now her wings would remain tucked away inside her dress, and she would walk the ground instead of fly through the air. She would act the part of a human, until she had a new plan of action to deal with the pillar. What was the worst that could happen? She'd seen plenty of excellent examples of human behavior. Hood covering her white hair, the new cloak and dress keeping the rest of her inhuman features secret, she took a few hesitant steps out into the street proper. And then instantly stopped, realizing she'd made a critical mistake. She needed some sandals. Humans didn't walk around barefoot, did they? Book 3, Chapter 15, The Friends We Made Along the Way. Wrapped up feet walked across the pavelled stone grounds. She hadn't been able to find sandals. Or any kind of footwear. It seems humans did not keep such items outside to dry off, and Tennyson had no ideas to offer, clearly out of his depth as well. So Tarath had to make do with strips of linen cloth from a destroyed towel she'd cut with her blades. She wasn't quite happy with the result. No traction or grip, it made her feel uneasy. If a fight occurred, she would be at a great disadvantage. For the last few hours, she'd been aimlessly walking the empty alleys and streets, simply mapping out the city. Tennyson walked at her side, keeping pace, occasionally pointing her down another pathway away from possible contact with people, but otherwise remaining quiet. As if equally learning the lay of the land as she did. The feather didn't have the energy to doubt him right now, instead she found herself mostly brooding on the results of the war. Where had she gone wrong? The attack had been planned out perfectly. She'd struck back when they had been deprived of the majority of their knights, after their failed early assault. By all calculations, she should have easily stormed past their gateway and gone right into the city heart. The only result she could come up with was simple tactical skill on the enemy commander, General Zhang. He had fought well. Without logistics to handle due to the single-day nature of the battle, a huge facet of war slipped away. The fight had been a singular event and point. None of the soldiers on the opposing side had required resupplies, rest or even food rations. Those had all been pre-supplied before the start of the action. Humans could operate under stress for several days before breaking down. The solution then to force logistics back into the equation, would be to continue the assault and make sure the humans never retook ground outside their gates. In doing so, the next attack would start directly at the witching hour, when the pillar was down. She'd walked far enough away from her initial starting point. Time had passed. The humans were likely far less on the hunt for rogue signals now, especially in her more remote location. Tarath opened up her system's communications suites, and began to verify the integrity of what had happened. Reports began to ping back, and she sorted through the aftermath. With her out of command, her army's cohesion had broken down. They had never assigned a backup commander, nor a chain of command. A weak point she had been blind to, clearly. Her other forces had each reverted to their original instincts. The runners had reformed into smaller hunting groups, and scattered away. The older, and smarter ones had continued with her tools and training, gathering under the command of Yerob, who led them to safety. Those survived the aftermath, stalking the lands. The others had been chased out, either destroyed or forced to turn away. Serpents, what few of them remained, slunk away, and began to pepper the surrounding area with acid, breaking down smaller human structures and abandoned defenses. All her spiders had retreated back to their nests, carrying whatever was theirs by right. Usually prizes and scraps of broken tanks or other trinkets to hoard in their dens. Her behemoths had all been dispatched, including the last one. Even with their size and power, they had been mere obstacles to Kedra and the flying knights she'd come with. The next attack would require more planning and strategy if she was to win. In the meantime, she sent a command to Yerob to continue keeping the humans penned inside their gatehouse and siege the whole construction. The pillar repels machines, but it didn't repel weapons fire. More behemoths would be made and sent out, to continue peppering the failing gatehouse with more holes for future entry, and force the city onto the defensive. Keeping them from rebuilding and repairing the current damage was important. There was one thing that remained stuck in Taratha's mind, through and through. The Unity fractal had been shut off. Her mother's eyes and ears had been blinded and deafened. The pillar likely targeted anything that carried that fractal, but it hadn't been lethal to her soul fractal for some reason, unlike the other machines that had charged in with her. The Chosen had been able to walk through the gates without issue, but they were mostly humans, so that hadn't been a surprise. She wasn't sure why the pillar had spared her, and only her. Without the unity fractal looming over her mind, anything Tarath did here and now could be scrubbed away digitally such that no report would ever be unearthed. The thought grew, larger and larger until it was the only thing she could think about. There was a thrill to it, even despite the crushing defeat she'd been handed by the stubborn humans. Until the city fell, Tarath was free of her mother's supervision. Perhaps the invasion didn't need to be accomplished so quickly. There was value in reconnaissance and intelligence after all. And the best source of information is gathered and verified personally. The more Tarath considered her situation, the more she came to the conclusion that she'd ended up exactly where she should be. Deep behind enemy territory and perfectly hidden among their number. If Yarab and the machine army did their work correctly, the next week's war would begin right at the city doorsteps against a completely crushed-in gatehouse. A far more easy matchup. In effect, victory was within reach already. Only, delayed by a single week. Everything was still on plan. She turned and set off with a spring in her step, for where the humans concentrated the most. Her mind going through all the possible aspects of humanity she could witness and learn from first-hand. Such knowledge would surely come in handy. Every step she took, it felt like she became more comfortable with the streets and the city. The battle was over. There was nothing to do for now but wait the week out for her future victory. Her disguise was perfect. From anyone else's perspective, she was simply another human walking around the city. In under an hour, she'd found herself at the docks. Revelers, all shouting and many clearly drunk, flocked around the place. It was deeper into the night, nearly half a day since the victory, and the full celebration was ebbing on the slowdown as the drunks fell asleep. Some people had already crashed on the sides of the walls, letting the world pass by them in a dizzy haze. She passed by them, drawing an odd number of looks from the slightly more sober. It was interesting to see the humans in their natural environment. Laughing, dancing, cheering, all kinds of emotions passing over their face. Tarath walked through the center street, eyes constantly looking around to take in the strange alien sight. A man bumped into her, holding his belly all the while. "Hey ya sweetlin, why the hood? Hidin' them pretty eyes of yours or something? Want me to buy ya a drink?" Another hand wrapped around her shoulder, and a woman's voice spoke. "That's my sister, she's always been shy about her face. Enjoy the festival, my friend, see you around." Audio recognition software had identified the woman's voice from the very first word. A warmth had spread through Tarath a moment after, as if she'd expected to have been found like this, despite the low probability. Tamari dragged her away, looking mildly worried. The man, on the other hand, was not quite so happy with the turn of events. "Hey, I'm still talkin' and your sister can say yes or no for herself. Quit being such a nosite." Tamari's hand dragged her away. "Sorry, we really need to be going right now, enjoy the festival." The man's hand reached out, grabbing Tarath's own arm. "Come on, don't be such a sheltered prude. It's celebrating time. Scrapheads are all dead, city's going to live another week. I'll buy you both a drink. Don't make a scene, plenty of other people to hit on." Tamari hissed. "Read between the lines already." "I'm reading plenty, you're just a controlling sister talkin' over everyone." Tenny Cent hovered nearby. "Break his wrist," the ghost suggested. "It would be child's play for you." Tarath observed how the man held her arm, but she didn't quite trust the ghost's suggestion blindly. "May I break his wrist?" she asked Tamari instead. "He does not seem to want to let go of his own accord. It would be a possible solution to this." That instantly froze the conversation. The man seemed confused for a moment, and Tamari took the moment to speak. "Look buddy, I'm not trying to protect my sister from you. I'm trying to protect you from my sister. She's not, well in the head, okay? She's a danger. Shouldn't be out on the street in the first place. You know, not completely hinged in the head." She tapped her head with a finger a few times, as if communicating something to the man. One moment she's normal, and the next she'll be clawing your face off if you say the wrong thing. The man paused, and then looked Tarath up and down with drunken stupor, observing her dress and handcrafted shoes. Then, as if realizing something profound, finally let go, taking a step back. "Oh," he said. "Oh shit. Sorry. She do look a little crazy. What a shame." Tenicent grumbled, crossing spectral arms together. "What a shame." He agreed, for very different reasons. Tarath, on the other hand, frowned, turning to Tamari. "But I am in perfect command of my faculties," she said, indignant. "I know that." Tamari hissed under her breath, dragging the feather out of the street and away from the man. "But he doesn't need to know that," and it made him give up, without having to actually break his wrist. "See? You have a point," Tarath admitted. The situation had been resolved. She had other things to be curious about anyhow. "How did you find me? This is far quicker than I had predicted. I assumed I would need to search and find you first." This was a little puzzling, but she was still happy to have already connected with a friendly face. "I knew you'd pull something half-baked, exactly like this. I should have bet the others money on hindsight. Goddess damn it, that would have been easy money. Damn my morals. You even have a hood and everything, could you possibly be more stereotypical?" "This hood hides my features," Tarath countered. Then she paused for a moment, thinking. "And I look very good in it." Tamari stopped, turned, and stared. "Okay," she said, hand running down her forehead, and rubbing the sleep out of her eyes. "Okay. Yep, that one's on me. My fault. I should never have told you what humor was. Noon wears a hood at this time of day, you bucket of bolts for a head. You're adorable, but you're going to get yourself caught at this rate." The human tugged some more at Tarath's hand. "Now we've gotta get out of here fast before people start asking questions. The celebrations here are the best source of intelligence I can collect. Staying here and observing the festivities might further my goals." "Intelligence?" Tamari looked back at the crowds shouting and hollering to one another. "What in the 12 hells are you planning on learning from that? How to drink 3 shots and stand on a toe? How to win a cat-calling competition? That might have relevance in a future campaign in ways we do not yet know. All knowledge is worth pursuit." Tamari didn't answer for a moment, before rubbing her eyes with one hand in another desperate attempt to wipe the sleep away. "I can't believe I'm actually arguing, with a machine, about stranger danger. Not even half a day after the attack. I swear to the goddess, if I'm not here to look after you, what sort of trouble would you literally walk yourself into?" Tamari turned to glare up at the taller feather, like an older sister scolding her misbehaving sibling. "And don't you dare pout at me." Her hand snapped out to Tarath's cheeks and squeezed on instinct. "Wait." She paused. "How in the goddesses do you even know what a pout is?" That distracted the feather. She didn't know what a pout was, but apparently her facial subroutines had decided to run with that. Tarath let herself be dragged by Tamari in the meantime, pondering on her words. It only took a quick dictionary search to find the definition of pouting, and an angry follow-up query to discover what misbehaving subroutine thought it would be funny to send that command through. Of course, all she found under the software layer was simple logic, which concluded that this was the single most accurate emotion to display, to a high degree of certainty with a high degree of precision as well. None of her CMO's systems were trying to be funny. Her virtual subconscious ruled it understood her more than she understood herself, which troubled Tarath in a strange abstract manner she had no words to describe. She pouted further at the revelation instead. The next Tarath noticed, Tamari had dragged her to a house, knocked on the door, and slipped inside. The room was lowly lit, and surrounded by a few others. Chosen. She recognized all of them, Tamari's personal friends and co-workers. "I found her." Tamari said without any preamble, taking off her shoes and putting them to the side, along with her jacket. You guys can call off the search. There was a silent moment as the people inside had stopped their activities and stared. Maps had been printed out and posted up on the walls, along with red strings and written out notes. Circles and crossed out sections. The room seemed to be holding its breath. Tarath tilted her head slightly in confusion. Greetings, she said. I am online and functioning. That seemed to dispel the air. People buzzed around again, moving to grab supplies or to take down the maps. Where was she? I had my group look all over the slums and nobody saw anything. One of the men in the back said, nursing a cup of water. I was half convinced the black market really did take her. How did you find her? I found her by the edge of the festival, of course, right at the entry point from the slums. She more or less made a straight line there. Tamari said. Didn't I tell you, Marcus? Think the worst possible place for her to stumble into and multiply it by a factor of 5. It had to be the docks. She was the single most suspicious-looking person walking around. The people around gave Tarath worried looks. Lady Tarath, a smaller girl said in a tiny voice, approaching with a damp cloth. Please be more careful, you need a guide to help you in this city. The girl reached up on her toes and helped wipe off some lingering soot on the feather's cheeks. Another human had come to her right and was motioning for her to remove the cloak. We need to get her an actual disguise. A better dress for a start. And shoes, come to think of it. Tamari said, looking down at the wrapped-up feet. Angria, didn't you buy a skirt and blouse combination yesterday? Do you think it'll fit? The girl Tamari had been talking to was already bounding up the ladder to the second floor. I'll go grab it now. It'll look so much better than a hood. The hood was practical. Tarath frowned. There was no alternative to hiding my hair. She found herself holding some kind of fondness for the clothing. It was, after all, the first bits of human clothing she'd ever worn in her life. There was some kind of sentimentality to it. You're both the smartest and most senseless girl I've ever met. A real enigma, you know? It's like the gods flip a coin anytime you make a decision on anything. Tamari sighed, rubbing her eyes for the third time in a day. And then she pointed at Tarath's feet. You can literally change your features to a ridiculous degree. Add new feet? Why not? More wings? Sure, bring them on. Give yourself a set of 6, add a bunch of eyes to them if it strikes your fancy. You even told me you rearranged your internal organs before, tossed in vocal cords down your throat. Why not just command your hair to turn blonde? Oh. Tarath said, as the room went quiet. That hadn't occurred to me. Like she'd punctured the tension from the room, the silence melted away into chuckles and then outright laughing. That's okay. Tamari said to her side. You're outside your element here. But that's where we come in. We've got you back here safe and sound, so the worst is thankfully past us. Now, what do we do from here? Tarath thought. The attack failed. And within 2 weeks, my elder brother Tuekar will no doubt return underground to check on my progress. If the city is not in our control at that point, he will likely wage a war of annihilation. She wasn't quite sure what would happen to herself at that point. Tuekar did not suffer failure. The city must surrender, and soon. I will need options from here. The mention of their former master brought a shiver to everyone present. They'd known who he was, and the cruelty that came with him. None wanted to return to that. Well, asking them to just surrender again isn't gonna work. An elderly man in the back said. Need to wait a few more days for the reality of the situation to start weighing on them again. They survived the first wave, but they know deep down they won't have that much chances for the second. Very first attack and the lady nearly got to their pillar in 15 minutes. And this was at their single most prepared moment. The next round they won't have even half the advantages they had this time, and the people know it. Problem is that morale is at an all-time high right now, even if they all know in the back of their heads it's over. What do we do against that? We keep doing what we've been doing so far. Tamari said. There's a lot of us all around. We can continue looking for the deserters, the people who can see the writing on the wall. When the time's right, we'll call on all of them and storm the pillar. That hasn't been working out so far. The man said. Nobody trusts the machines are going to stick to their side of the bargain. Maybe they need to speak to one directly. Tamari said. And we just happen to have the best one here. Gather them all up a few days from now, we'll introduce Tarath directly, and she can make her case in person. It's one thing to get reassurances from faraway strangers, it's another to hear it directly from the Grand Leader herself. That got some nods of approval. What is Lady Tarath going to do in the meantime? I don't think we can convince her to stay inside for long. A woman said to the side. She coughed. I mean no offense of course, Lady Tarath. But we've all long known about your curiosity. I am not sure what you mean. Tarath said, bemused. Your statement is factually accurate. Tamari grinned, giving her a quick hug while laughing. Of course you'd say that. She turned to the rest of the room. While you lot deal with getting people together, I'm going to socialize our fearless leader here. We're in the center of the city, I think it's time Our Lady had a day off and got to see some of the better parts of life. Book 3, Chapter 16, in which Tarath has a wholesome day off. Focus your mind. Relax your breathing. Should you find your mind drifting, notice it, forgive yourself, and move on. Tencent said, translucent arms crossed on the other side of the quiet room. I do not need to breath. My mind remains focused on any topic I assign. She said, to which Tencent scoffed. You asked. He said, take the advice, or don't. Tamari told her they would be going out in the morning. That left Tarath alone in the living room parlor. It had, after all, been very late into the night for them when they'd found her. They'd been up since the end of the attack searching for her, unprompted. Exhausted, they all soon crashed in their makeshift beds, sound asleep. And a feather had no need for sleep. So she'd asked Tencent how he passed time since there were a good amount of hours before Tamari and the rest of the Chosen woke up. It was only polite to at least attempt to follow through on the advice, after all. It was true she didn't need to breath, but her shell did automatically simulate the action. And besides, it offered a method of passive cooling, if rather small. Thought-wise, her CMO's systems were unable to deviate from any instructions, so she saw little benefit to that part of the exercise. Her mind couldn't wander around. She tried again, taking the traditional pose for meditation. Tencent nodded, and sank down into a sitting position, mirroring her own. He wasn't truly there of course, only a mental image mapped out into the world. But he certainly acted and reacted as if he were. She wondered how he saw the world from his point of view, given his decoherent form. Fractals rarely made sense, and there was far more that was unknown about them than known. She was treading on grounds few people had ever studied or even known about. Perhaps he saw what she saw and interpolaw. You're allowing your mind to drift. Tencent said dryly. Tarath snapped back to the present. I do know. She paused, and realized she had. How did you notice? You fidget. He said. Her? A feather of relinquished? Fidgeting? Preposterous. I do not fidget. You just did, again. He stared her down, as if daring her to call him a liar. Glare at me all you want, girl. That won't change that you have and do fidget. She scanned through the logs of her past movements, certain the dead human was pulling a fast one on her, and found out the human was correct. Clearly, her background subroutines were taking a bit too much liberty. Where had those habits and mannerisms developed from in the first place? Or rather, when had they appeared? over time or all at once. From what stimuli? These systems would monitor her neuromorphic parts and cross-reference the strings of thoughts into matching physical action. The system was working as intended when she looked into it, only it was being fed undisciplined thoughts and acting on those. Your mind is drifting again. Tennyson said, stay focused. And stop squirming. Feeling greatly embarrassed, she took more direct control of her shell, putting a stop to the fidgeting once and for all. As a result, keeping all parts of herself in balance became far harder now that she was in command rather than leaving it to her background processes. She almost lost balance and fell face first. There were hundreds of smaller autocorrections her CMO's systems handled passively for her, and all of it has already been trained on hundreds of hours monitoring her inattentive thoughts. There was a lot of cleanup to do. She had to be dignified, as a feather should be. Relinquished expected perfection from her feathers. An hour passed like this, with Tennyson slowly grinding away all the small quirks of meditation, anywhere from posture to keeping more control over her mental sphere. As a machine, no body position would change the efficiency of her functions, and she entered the whole project with a mild feeling of annoyance, but she'd asked and felt accountable to follow it through as a matter of stubborn pride, and so she did. Somehow, at some point, there began to be an odd sense of serenity to it that she wasn't able to pinpoint within her systems. She'd begun to notice that there was far more happening deeper in her mind, with the ghost's incessant prodding whenever she'd started to ponder on something else. Logical threads were easy to follow and understand. A simple query would return all information relevant to a decision. But deeper under, were threads of emotions. They appeared from her neuromorphic parts and were mutated somehow as they passed through the soul fractal. It gave her much to think about. Machines could operate without souls, and they originally had for many decades before fractals were discovered. But artificial souls mixed with neuromorphic engineering had been a breaking point to true sapience during the golden age of humanity. Somewhere inside was the key to all these unwanted changes she was suffering from. If only she could figure it out and be more like Tuekar and the feathers of his generation onward. They remained static, unchanging, for centuries. Eternal. Perfect. I'm surprised you are not frantic to secure the pillar. Tennyson said after some time, bringing up a new topic. There is no point making a hasty move. She told the ghost. Rather, this will be one of the few times I will see human culture without interference. And if she was honest, she felt more relaxed now than ever before. Perhaps ever in her life. There was no war here and now. She had lost the initial volley, and further attacks would happen on a timeline, on schedule. There was nothing to do but wait. The meditation seemed to calm her down after learning how to do it correctly. Helped her smooth out strings of emotions by tracking them down. It was peaceful. She could have told Tennyson this. But she didn't, still skirting away from saying such blasphemous things like enjoying a calm moment. Feathers were weapons of war. Their natural state was in the middle of a battle. That was their purpose. She shouldn't be feeling this way, being content with the lack of action. It went counter to her baseline goal. Instead, she plucked out an acceptable cover. Observing how the humans here act and react will give me a metric to compare to once I have control of the city. If they return to the same behavioral patterns, then I will know my command over the city is complete. I do this for research purposes. That sounds an awful lot like an excuse, girl. Tennyson said. She tutted, turning her head sharply away. The human had an uncanny ability to catch her in her lies. Truly annoying. But I agree with the course. He finished. Tarath quirked an eyebrow at that, turning her head to him. He shrugged at the implied question, parts of his blue translucent shoulders going through the pillar. I lived a life following only goals. I devoted myself to my vow as a knight retainer. I lived to be only what others expected of me. It was not a life well spent, in hindsight. Color only came into it when I met my wife. He looked down, almost flinching. She showed me things that changed how I saw and lived life. For the better. I had something to protect. Someone to protect, of my own choice. All because I took a single step outside the narrow confines of my path. Perhaps the same will happen for you. My greatest memories are those I found outside what was expected of me. Tarath viewed the timetable. Still 4 more hours to go before Tamari would be within waking period. May I see some of these memories? She asked idly. Tenicent didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned, eyes narrowed. Why are you even asking? Shouldn't you be able to take whatever you want? A good point. She could simply rip any memory from Tenicent's head and view it at her leisure. She almost did, but there seemed to be some dividing, morality line within her. It felt wrong. That was novel. Again another one of those strange new emotions within her. She dove further into it, trying to understand where it had come from. There were no such feelings on taking Tenicent's skills and combat experience. When she attempted to read what his current plots were, and failed, that too did not feel like crossing a line. Although, she hadn't tried again ever since. She considered it further and realized the reality was far more simple. Spiders always had a sense of respect among themselves, it was only natural for this to follow as I shifted form into a feather. At the core, my roots remain the same. She said. When my sisters claimed prey as their own, I respected their wishes. Hence, my kind are capable of feeling respect. And that evolved into some kind of respect for the enemy. Tenicent asked. Something akin to that. I do not see any reason my enemies shouldn't be afforded basic respect. The combat aspects of your memories are part of my war effort and a tactical necessity, thus I have no qualms on taking those for myself. Your personal life is of no tactical necessity. That would be peering into a memory for no reason but to satisfy my own curiosity. It is not right. Tenicent said nothing, only thinking. The surface clans live and breath honor. For both one's house, and for the enemies one faces. The only enemies not deserving of respect, are animals. You pillaged from those memories originally. They might have imparted more than you bargained for. You think your combat memories have affected my sense of morality. The feather scoffed at that. I don't see how that would be possible. He shrugged again. Something did over time. The only one who can answer that question is yourself. The ghost made a show of standing back up from his meditation pose, and walked over, slowly, lumbering. As if dreading work that needed to be done. Still, he reached where she sat, and took his own seat next to her. A beat passed before he sighed and spoke. I'll share with you some of my better memories. Just this once. If you are willing to see. He extended a hand. Tarath considered the offer for a moment, and then took it. This will be perfect. Tamari said, fixing up some more of the feathers on Taratha's new headwear. Plus it'll match your new hair. Blonde and blue is a great combo. Tarath watched the mirror like a hawk. The headdress had dozens of synthetic feathers, all different shades of dark blue and grey complementing one another, with a white bird-like skull mask to hide her features. I am not familiar with Puritans, or their customs. She said. This outfit, does it have ceremonial usage? The night had come and passed. Tenicent was nowhere to be seen now, having retreated back into his cell. He'd ended up sharing more than just one memory of his. In between, Tarath had shared some of her own memories, as a spider. The non-violent ones at least. There seemed to be an unworded agreement between both not to show the other anything that wasn't more clean. While her old life had been far more simple, there had been plenty of smaller memories she still remembered and cherished. It felt more like sharing stories to one another. In a manner of speaking. Tamari said, bringing Taratha's mind back to the present. The whole gist is that it's modeled after these extinct birds that once lived during the Golden Age. Parrots I think they were called. Anyhow, Puritans are all about how life is superior to machines, so the colors and vibrancy of the parrots is symbolic to them. The raptor skull mask invokes images of the ultimate aerial hunter. It's a counterpart to how the automatons look out there. And it works really well to hide your face while still blending in. We need a new name for you too. Wrath seems a little too edgy, even for Puritans. Wrath is already shortening my name. I do not like to change my name. Tarath said, feeling defensive. It's just a name. Names have meaning. She said, crossing her arm and frowning. Fine, how about you pick a name with meaning then? The feather wanted to argue, but found herself running short on debate points. It was difficult to explain how important names were to machines. Humans seemed to take them far too lightly. Unfortunately, she really could not continue to call herself Tarath while being undercover. Sophia. Tarath said after a moment of contemplation. I believe that will do fine. Tamari shrugged. Old school of a name, but sure. Works for me, Sophia. Any reason why that name? It is the root of knowledge. I seek knowledge above all. As a name, it represents me enough. The human didn't seem to quite understand the leap, given her puzzled look. You stated these birds are extinct. Tarath said, changing the subject. Machines are not extinct. Clearly one hunter survived while the other perished. These Puritans should pick a different analogy. Tamari huffed, patting her shoulder and fixing up the leather straps and pockets of the dress. It's less about the technicalities and more about going with the flow. Besides, you look great in all this. The more you stand out with distinct features, the less people will equate you with the runaway feather. They'll just remember you as a Catrian girl celebrating with the others. And besides, you're a feather, so wearing feathers is sort of poetic. Like an inside joke for us. Again, I am not familiar with Puritans. What are Catrian girls? Tarath asked. Dancers. It's complicated, you'll get it when you see it. You will need to give me something to work with, if anyone begins to ask me questions. Tamari took her hand and brought her up from her seat. In the mirror, Tarath looked like a mix between urban and feral. The half-skirt dress turned into a hoodie that did little to hide her stomach. Apparently that was intentional. Pockets of all kinds were sewed on her arms and shoulders, all of it with little use or outright covered up by longer blue feathers that served as honorary shoulder pads. Makeup was applied that darkened the sides of her eyes, and gave her an almost brooding look. With her two blades at her left side, she looked like a feral tech blade of some kind. A ridiculous outfit. It looked nice. Yes. Nice would be a good word for it. Unique. Different. It scratched an itch deep inside her. She hadn't seen this kind of outfit from any of the citizens around, it stood out in a way she found pleasing. It was sleek. Certainly not practical, but that hardly mattered. Catrian girls were dancers, not fighters, according to Tamari. Puritans are an oddity among religions. Less a religion and more a movement. In the city, they don't even have a church. They just gather up in different places for sermons on the floating rocks and to partake in, let's say, mind-altering substances. The city's mostly imperials. So you won't have to worry too much about blowing your cover. People will just assume you're Etienne and leave you alone. Tamari opened the door and stepped out into the bright artificial sunlight. Tarath stalked behind, the clothing rustling with each step. The floating rocks are used by Puritans. The feather asked. Tennyson hadn't know what they were for either. Apparently they served a religious purpose. That seemed odd to Tarath, they could have been used for far more things. Tamari laughed, brushing her shoulder feathers amicably. No, not at all silly. Only a few of those slabs get colonized and built on, the ones low enough for buildings to reach. The rest are too high up right now. The floating slabs where all the young people go, because older adults have a hard time climbing up all those ladders. And Puritans are all about rebellion and self-autonomy, so most Puritans tend to be teenagers or in that age bracket. I had a phase too with them until it wasn't practical anymore to be openly Puritan for my work. But I'm 22, so still not an old hag. I've got some contacts to pull on. They walked through the streets, heading for a specific direction. Vendors of all kinds hawked out goods around them, and Tamari indulged it all. She had the money to spend. Food of all kinds were passed on to Taratha for tasting. This was perhaps the best part of her day so far. Every bite was something new and wonderful. Just now, Tamari brought back some kind of steamed vegetable on a stick, interspersed with chicken meat. The skewer was divine. See, Imperials are always old and stuffy, all about traditions and long sermons. Tamari said as the two ate on the walk, but their faith makes more sense. More grounded. Puritans on the other hand are all loose and anecdotal. Each kindred has their own branching lore and ideas, so when Puritans from one kindred visit another, it's more a mutual sharing of different ideas. Even the Catrian dance has different moves unique to cities, so collecting new movements is part of a game girls play it. Imperials always have the exact same doctrine, same scriptures, and everything's far more consistent. That's probably why people end up gravitating to them. There's other established religions out there, like the Hosrake, the Warlocks Bokdaram, the Tenials, and the Might Speakers, but all that's going to get real confusing, and most of those religions are not present in the city. Humans communicate with mites? Tarath asked, feeling confused. Those that follow that religion say they do, or did in the past. Not really a lot of them these days. Mites always have been an enigma to me. Say, how are they on the machine side? They have a firewall of around their digital space. Smaller programs can filter through, but surviving past the mite wall is difficult. Anything larger that attempts to pass through the wall never returns. They're an enemy? Tamari asked, confused. A neutral party. I believe they have been spotted assisting both sides of the conflict at different times. Like humans, they are not a monoculture. As for their goals and objectives, the archives machines have access to show no results. What does the human mite religion do? Perhaps they know more than we do. Tamari thought for a moment. Most people don't pay attention to speakers because only the mentally unwell ones says they can speak to mites. Usually they're like doomsday preachers, talking about prophesies. The ones that aren't lunatics are more likely grifters. We don't have any here, mostly we're just a city of Imperials. Very traditional. She handed Tarath what looked to be a grilled rat on a stick. Pipe rat with chakram spices. A staple for the lower income, but personally I find it tastier than crab. It's, like, my comfort food. How do you eat this? Tarath asked. But Tamari was already away, buying another set of food from a vendor further down the road. With little options, the feather shrugged, and simply ate the whole rat in one bite. It was oddly juicy, filled with rendered fat that paired well with the soft tissue and cooked protein. Whoa, that's metal! A voice said behind her. She turned and saw tiny humans. 3 of them. Boys. One of the children pointed at her hand. She even ate the bones and everything. Tarath flushed, suddenly connecting the dots that perhaps she shouldn't be eating the whole animal off the skewer like so. Too late now. Another boy scoffed. She's a Tien like me. He said proudly. Of course she'd be tough. Told ye. Tiens are all just show. The other kid said. A single crusader would beat 100 tiens and still have time to eat a meal. My dad said so. The first turned around, angry, and a fight quickly came down between the two. The third came up to Tarath, tugging on her skirt, ignoring his 2 friends currently wrestling one another. How did it taste? He asked. With the bones. Tarath looked down on the small child and thought for a reply. Crunchy. She finally said. Less was better, especially since the first child had claimed to also be a Puritan. She didn't want to be caught as a fraud this early. "You kids bugging my friend here," Tamari said, walking back into range. The two on the ground shot back up, all problems forgotten and forgiven. Tamari's hand shot out and ruffled the hair of one of the kids. He scrunched up and backstepped away, hands brought up as if ready to go into a fight. Tamari laughed like bells would chime. "Wow, so tough. But do you think you could beat her in a fight? Think your dad could take her on?" The kid glanced over to Tarath, and then to her empty skewer. "Yeah, I could take her on. Easy," he said with a gulp. "Statistically unlikely," Tarath said, but her attention was focused elsewhere, specifically on what Tamari was bringing back with her. The girl grinned, and passed what looked like an orange claw to Tarath. "Here, you little glutton. I was talking about crab earlier, turns out the shop way down there had some in stock. Give it a try. 6-clawed rock crab, a fisherman's staple." She brought up another claw and took out a small pocket knife, which she used as a lever to snap the exoskeleton off. From there she sucked out the meat. The feather observed and brought up her own crab claw. Cooked orange, with what looked to be bits of red flakes, and dripping a butter compound of some kind. Steaming off the shell. She didn't have a tool to break the meat open, but a quick scan showed the composition was chitin, protein, and calcium carbonate. Mostly brittle and of little challenge. She snapped the claw with a press of her fingers. The meat had been crushed in the process by accident, she'd put too much pressure. But enough of it was left over to be edible. She quickly went on to doing exactly that, comparing the vastly different texture and taste of crab to rat. Cataloging it all, and saving the memory. Yerob and the other runners would greatly appreciate this. Unlike the rat, this meat had a sweet taste to it, soft and melting away. The bits of pulverized shell added a nice crunch to the whole thing too. Unlike the rat bones, the shell fragments were far more random and interspread. "Still think you can beat her in a fight, tough guy?" Tamari asked while Tarath focused on eating. The child had turned white for some reason, and took a step back as the feather swallowed, snapped off another bit of claw and sucked out the meat inside like Tamari had done. Less shell this time, but that gave a slightly different profile to compare the data to. "Maybe when you hit your growth spurt, you'll get to hang out with us again, you little scamps," she said, patting him again on the head and lightly pushing him on the way. He got the message and the other kids all followed behind, quickly kicking off into a sprint, chasing after the lead in some impromptu game Tarath hadn't yet understood. The last one ran away, waving goodbye. She returned the wave, awkwardly. The claw fragments of the crab were not making it easy. "That was a novel encounter," Tarath commented. "The disguise worked. One of them claimed to be a Puritan and he did not suspect my status. Of course it worked. I know my stuff," Tamari said, puffing her chest out. "Ready to keep going? I've got more food to show you on the way, you'll love this next dish." "She discovered your weakness quickly," Tenicent said to Tarath's side. The ghost floated around, watching over. "She does not," Tarath chided in private to Tenicent. "Food is simply enjoyable. You could eat a cement wall and say it was appetizing," Tenicent said. Feeling miffed at the thought, she tossed the memory of eating the crab down into the cell that housed the ghost. The old warrior had been a clanner, food like crab wasn't something he'd ever eaten before. She saw him pause, frown, open his mouth to complain and then stop again, and frown some more. "See? Enjoyable," Tarath said, feeling a puff of triumph. It's about time she got one up on him. For the rest of the trip down the docks, anytime the old man was about to complain, she threw at his face another recently made memory of food, and that did excellent at shutting him up. Seemed to her, that she'd found his weakness just as easily. Everyone liked food. Even if the stubborn ghost wasn't willing to admit it out loud. The rock overhangs were exactly what Tamari mentioned. To reach the floating slabs, rope ladders were the only path up, unless one could climb. Every few years some dumb kid makes a mistake and slips off these slabs. Tamery said. History says that's part of the reason tent roofs became a thing in this city, supposedly it saved a few lives. The old city government tried to ban coming up here multiple times, but it's never stopped teenagers. So eventually they caved and set up nets under the slabs. It's all ancient history. They're a little hard to spot from the ground, but you can see them more clearly from here. Climbing was a novel experience for Taratha. Usually she would fly anywhere she chose. Tamery climbed just above, keeping a steady pace, her body angled to keep the rope set right. She could see some of the other, lower slabs, having small gatherings of people, surrounding a bonfire of some kind. They seemed to be speaking to one another, but given the wind and distance, not even Taratha's hearing was able to make sense of it all. And they were all youth of some kind. Adults were nowhere to be spotted up here, with the effort required to climb. The top of the slab was a small grassy plain, with a central masonry. What looked to be ruins of a mite construction, little more than eroded walls now with moss growing anywhere it could take root. At the center was a small gathering of people, all wearing outfits similar to Taratha's. Each had their own unique flair, though the overall theme remained consistent. Tamery had told her more about these people on her climb. She felt reasonably prepared to join this social circle. Hey all! I'm back! Tamery said, waving to the group. They turned and stared for only a moment before standing back up and rushing over, crowding around her. Who's the new girl? One of the women asked, pointing at Taratha. I am Sophia. Taratha lied. I'm new to the city, and arrived right before the machine blockade hit. The news seemed to sour people, as they grew quiet. Scrappers. Always trouble, eh? One said. Glad you made it before the chopping block. Why not come by earlier? She was prepared for that. I wanted to work on my outfit, but Tamery helped speed that up. Originally this was supposed to have been Tamery's. The girl had been working on it in secret a few years ago, before her troubles hit. She handed it off to a friend, who'd gone and returned it once Tamery returned. With Taratha's arrival, the girl didn't seem to mind giving her hard-worked outfit away. According to her, she could always make a new one. The new group asked her further questions, light probes to find out more who she was rather than question the validity of her persona. She answered each as practiced. Soon, they invited her back around their fire. A large bucket filled with stripped crawdad tails was presented. Grab a skewer, nail one of these up and put it over the fire. One of the boys said to her, handing her a thin wooden stake. The city seemed in love with any kind of food that could be handled with a stick, it seemed. She commented as much. I don't know what your city's like, Sophia, but here we mostly deal with seafood. The lake provides a basically unending source of it. The boy said. Machines might have us surrounded, but they can't ever starve us out. Another said, to a small cheer from the group. You guys know that's bunk, right? Tamery said, if the city alone could make all the food in the world we wouldn't have farms on the other hollows. The city's going to run out of food eventually, not anytime soon, but eventually. Never took you for a downer, the boy said. I remember you'd always be looking on the bright side of things. What happened since you left? I had to live outside the ring for months and saw the machines face to face. What do you think? Tamery said. Of course that changes a person. Got to be more realistic and down to earth. Besides, you guys heard the rumor about the machines accepting surrender now. That got a heated debate among the group. Taratha watched, eating roasted crawdad after crawdad while the group debated politics and their place in the world. Tamery had been correct, the people were not unwilling to surrender, they simply didn't know if the machines would let them live after. They needed personal confirmation. They've changed. Taratha said, drawing attention for the first time. The machines. They will not hurt you if you prove you are not a threat. Tamari glanced at her nervously, but the others were already there asking questions. You sound like you know this firsthand. Did you run into a machine while you were outside? Tarath nodded. In a manner of speaking, she had. But for her persona, there was a different story to tell. We reached the gates safely because we surrendered. The machines let us pass. So I have seen firsthand that they can cooperate with humans, in good faith. The group grew quiet until one of the older men stepped in. Sounds like they might be returning to their base programming? They were originally made to serve humans. Not killing us is a good step in the right direction. They're the manifestation of human evil, but humans overcome evil on a daily basis. Maybe the bit of humanity in them is returning? It's in our nature to overcome evil. Steel rusts but the flesh rebuilds. The group murmured. Tarath remained puzzled. She knew this religious sect believed that humanity and machines had been one and the same at some point, but a schism caused the two to split. Historically, they might be referencing cybernetics and older human augmentation, or at least as far as Tarath could suspect. Data was not completely whole, even the machine archive is missing great swaths of it. Either locked away by the Pale Lady for her own reasons, or deleted in the First War. It was easier to destroy than it was to capture and preserve, and the early days had all be about capitalizing on surprise. It was pleasant to spend time with people like this, hiding among them. The talk continued deeper into the night, and Tarath learned more about the city's stance on the machines. The military had been tight-lipped about machines allowing surrender, up until too many refugees had arrived and let it slip. From there it became a rumor, and soon it would have to be revealed as full truth. Kedra was an odd topic she hadn't expected. Apparently the duel between her and the surface girl had gone public, at least recordings taken from the final moments. The rumors were that the leak had been intentional, to increase morale. That had certainly worked, as the group considered the Surface Knights to be folk heroes. A lot of faith was being put on them to help save the city. They called her a sword saint, the first human in history to ever be able to stand and fight against a feather. A lot of the Imperials believed her to be an emissary of the Golden Goddess, as much as Kedra herself denied such rumors. However, one knight, no matter how skilled, could not turn the tide of an entire war. That would be absurd. Tarath was certain of this. Before she could even take a bite from her next crawdad, an alarm blared obnoxiously loud in her mind, set to maximum possible volume, causing her to outright flinch in surprise. She shut it off with a spark of fury and went digging into where it had even come from. As she discovered, it was hardwired a week ago by herself, specifically set to trigger any time she thought a Winterscar wasn't going to be a problem, to remind her that every single Winterscar Tarath had met in her life, she'd ended up with a problem. She crunched the crawdad whole, not bothering to deshell it, angrily chewing away, to the surprise of the others around the fire. Tarath really needed to stop doing this exact mistake every single time. It always blew up in her face. Once was a coincidence. Twice was an anomaly. 3 times, that's a repeating predictable pattern. She didn't know how the Winterscars would throw off her plan this time around, but newfound instinct was now screaming in her mind that they would, somehow. The feather wondered what Keith was doing right now on the surface. From the handful of memories Tennyson had shared with her, she guessed it was probably something sinister. Book 3, Chapter 17, Chasing down a rogue airspeeder for loot and profit. An explosion rocked the wall side, scattering larger boulders down until a gap appeared. Bright white began to shine through, like beams in the dusty twilight of the cave. A beat passed before another explosion shook the leftovers and the whole wall collapsed down. 4 relic knights zipped through the new openings, led by Shadow Song. The man landed hard on the ground, blades out and ready, scanning around for anything. His helmet passed over the remains of the Nightbreaker, one half of which was already in my hand, while I was on the way to recover the second along with a few fragments of broken chains. "Enemy?" he asked, straightening up from his crouch. Chased away. I said, the OL Nightbreaker here lived up to expected value, though I don't think it'll work a second time against this particular foe. I had surprise on my side this time around. Also, finally found out why they're after me too in the trade. Shadowsong nodded. Explain on the way. We need to move, or the Chosen will escape me. What foe attacked? Who is behind this? My hands reached the last sliced off half of my work and awkwardly affixed them to my hip while the group and I jogged up the ruined avalanche back up to the opening. You remember that Feather Atius fought off underground? Impossible. Shadowsong growled, more to himself. Machines don't travel to the surface. What's changed? Ropes were already being lowered down, a set of 5, one of each of us. I grabbed hold of mine, hooked a carabiner and used my arms and legs fully to scale the sheer wall side. I'd have picked up some extra scrap from the blasted off pieces of my homicidal stalker as a trophy, but the chains had some serious work and there wasn't anything I could spot in good enough piece. The recording of the fight would be enough for now. Teed's airspeeder hovered right over the edge of the abyss, the ropes lowered directly from the bay side doors. Risky move all in all, airspeeders couldn't really fly, they only hover up to 13 feet of clearance, at most. If the ship drifted off even slightly, it would fall down into the hole, dragging everyone with it. Enemy is already on the move, their airspeeder is retreating. Teed said on the comms. We hit them with an engine buster right when the ground exploded, so they're limping right now. But they're still getting away. Get up here fast. Relic armor made the climb supremely easy, with my legs kicking me up leap after leap. See, I think it's got to do with that bunker underground. Only Lord Atius, Kedra, and I got inside there. And Atius is a deathless, it would be impossible to get anything out of him. My sister and I? We're plain old humans. Easy targets. She's gone, so I'm the only one left to grab. That's my guess at why he's hunting here. Shadowsong climbed swiftly at my side, keeping pace. Could he be related to the slavers? Beats me. Maybe they found out he's after me and tried to swipe me up first? Make a quick profit. Other siders have their hands in everything. Wouldn't be surprised if they're also in touch with the machines and found all this out through the Chosen. What happened on your side of the wall? A machine ambush of some kind. Sagrius answered over the comms, helmet appearing from the bay doors far above. They must have selected this area specifically for the weaker ground here. We fell down into a machine nest of some kind, filled with 6-legged monsters. The men and I don't have experience fighting machines, but Shadowsong did. He taught us in the field how to fight and handle these turrets and their spider guardians, by demonstration. We lost anyone. No casualties, Master Keith, though some of us are low on shield energy from the initial volleys. Nothing that would cripple us from further action. You done with the gossip? Teed said, joining the comms. HQ ordered a pirate airspeeder and I aim to deliver. Now hurry up already, the food's getting away. A few more leaps and we were out back on the surface. From here, it was one jump up, using the rope as a guidance, before my hand gripped the edge of the airspeeder bay. The captain's gauntlets reached down and dragged me back up, into the ship. Shadowsong followed behind me along with the other knights. The ground buckled the moment the last knight had crawled inside. Inertia forced Journey down on a knee as the airspeeder twisted on its heels, and rocketed forward. Ice and wall sides zipped past my field of view on the sides of the open bay doors. I reached a hand to the grips on my side, holding tight. Teed wasn't taking it easy on the ship. Once the armor was used to the new speed, I stumbled my way forward to the ship's cockpit while the rest of the knights were busy strapping into seats. Pilot, patch me through to the enemy airspeeder. Shadowsong said behind me. Done. Teed answered, and the comms beeped a new connection. I opened the inner door and pulled myself into the control room, through the small interior. Ice and metal zipped across the windows in every direction ahead of me as Teed moved the massive airspeeder like a needle threading through fabric at odd angles. Enemy airspeeder. This is the Shadowsong Prime. We will be attacking and boarding your ship. Non-lethal methods will be employed, so long as hostages remain unharmed. Should we find any of them killed, you will die with them. Negotiations over. He cut the channel before any answer could be given. Chase them down. He said a moment after. We will handle the rest. Teed didn't give any answer other than pushing the thrust up, executing another quick turn, using the vector thrusters to nudge the ship in just the right ways to fit through gaps. We weren't going fast, the issue was fitting the massive ship inside the canyons. The metal ground under me hadn't gone flat a single moment since the very start of his maneuvers. On our way to catch up with them. Teed said, not looking back at me. Strap in. They've got a good head start on me. I took my seat, clicking the safety belts across my armor, and opened up the co-pilot suite. What's the situation, or do you need to focus? Focus? Please, this is a cakewalk compared to the difficulty the sim trainers had to crank their tests just to filter out the competition. He said, environmental suit hiding any features from showing on his face. So we'll catch up to them. I saw the radar screen showing a red marker a few hundred feet away, but the ice walls blocked all line of sight. He shrugged, taking another thin turn, forcing the nose of the ship down and sliding the ship across a more narrow pass. Eventually. For a crippled cargo airspeeder, they're making oddly good timing. Their pilot must be pretty good, or they know the area better than we do, underground included. Might be the latter. I said. That meeting spot had to have been picked specifically to pull that stunt on us in the event we came. What worries me is if they know underground openings large enough for an airspeeder to fit through. If they try to escape underground, I'm not sure it's a good idea to keep going after them. First time for everything. Teed said, keeping the two control sticks perfectly in sync with each other. Who knows, maybe driving underground is more fun. But I get you, catch them fast before they slip the noose. Think I know just the trick. He clicked a few keys and toggled on the general comms. Gonna get rough, I'm about to pull out some moves. He turned the comms again, cycling to the inner crew. Ferrum, you good with the cannons? I need a ramp up out of these chasms. The display aboard showed turrets being rotated, turning front side. A voice crackled on comms. Come in. Just don't be picky about how it looks. Hang starboard, I'll look for a good spot. Teed continued to pilot the bulky craft, hovering over the uneven ground, making headway in the general direction after the undersiders. Radar showed they were still farther off, though we were slowly catching up. The hull and cockpit shook, as our airspeeder opened fire on one side of the ice canyons, the heavy rounds shattering onto the sides, forcing a full collapse. Thanks Ferrum, exactly what I ordered. You're a shipbuilder though, that ain't up to code at all. Not even handrails on that thing. Tut tut. Teed said, turning the ship directly onto the impromptu ramp. Better not let the security goons back home see this, or they'll have you hanged. Shut the fuck up and drive, you twat. The gunner answered, irate. If you've got time to complain, you've got time to catch up to the enemy. The ship rumbled over the crushed ice, quickly climbing up until the angle was too steep for the massive airspeeder to continue up. Teed flared the thrust and angled the vector thrusters. It gave the whole ship a shuddering push, like two hands had grabbed the rear and pulled up, just enough to climb onto the top of the canyons. From above, we got our first sight at the fleeing undersider ship. The right-hand engine had been turned off completely, while the left one still moved, metal flaps opening and closing around the nozzle as the ship maneuvered. It flickered in and out of view as the bulky ship tried to navigate through the canyons. The gunner didn't waste the moment, opening fire on the enemy ship anytime there was a line of sight. See, what a lot of people don't realize is that intercept frigates like this one are light enough to do a Scotch hop, even with a full crew and cargo inside. Teed said, flicking flips and triggers, hands flying over the controls as he overclocked different systems. What the gods is a Scotch hop? I asked, a little worried. No, a lot worried. Most driving is pretty boring. But they still had to weed out pilots back home in the Sims. In turn, a lot of pilots discovered plenty of, let's say, interesting maneuvers that nobody in their right mind would guess could be done, just so we could get a leg up on the competition. You see some strange driving at the top leaderboards. All of it is technically possible, according to the Sims. Scotch was a pilot of the older days, and he coined the move. Put it this way, he was one crazy bastard. The ship groaned and dragged itself the rest of the way up, its bulk gliding over the top of the canyons. We were heading parallel on the top of the canyon, but a few hundred meters ahead, there was a clear cliffside. The ship didn't divert course. No, Teed increased the speed, all the while lowering the hover down to mere inches against the ground. Ice crushed under us as the underside of our ship scrapped anything past clearance. Is our ship rated for this kind of abuse? I asked, for the first time questioning my friend's abilities. We're in a metal monster that weighs several hundred tons, and all wrapped up snug in armor. Ground's all ice. It looks sturdy, it's anything but. I'd worry about the ice more than my ship, kid. The cliff was rapidly approaching. Teed's hands hovered over the altitude control lever. Instinct started to creep up in me. I found my hands already holding onto handholds, squeezing them tight. Right at the last moment, Teed punched the hover commands to max hover altitude possible. The ship lurched up, powered by golden aerotech that could lift the weight of the ship. Vector thrusters all lit up at the same time, assisting the momentum like hands holding a heavy bucket up. Our ship soared up and above the canyon, yawning, landing down with a heavy crunch on the other side. Ice and snow blinded the cockpit as the intercept frigate crashed down into the other side, altitude returns showing a negative number for a moment. The weight of the ship coming down had caused it to sink into the ice, but only for a moment. The hover remained at full power, easily pulling the ship back up as inertia carried us forward and out of the cloud of ice and snow we'd kicked up. The ship was undamaged, as far as all sensors showed. Teed was right about the specs, this ship was a beast. Are you huffing amp in your suit? The gunner yelled. URS fucking save me, you crazy motherfucker, this is the kind of flying you leave for the Sims, not while I'm riding shotgun up here. I can catch up to them the hard way, but if they really do have an underground tunnel lined up somewhere, that's game for us. Hard rules call for hard play. Teed said. Look, I can see them from here even. So, less yapping, more shooting. Ahead, the enemy ship was still limping away, trying to take sharp turns. But Teed's speed was rapidly approaching them now that he didn't have to deal with turns. It was a straight line to the enemy, without a care for any of the gaps he'd need to leap over. Another jump, and we were now right behind the enemy. From above, the gunnery turrets were making havoc on the armored pirate ship below, which was returning fire with feeble energy. The volley struck against parts of the enemy airspeeder but wasn't enough to deal significant damage yet, as the whole thing suddenly zipped away from sight, taking an extreme turn. That's why the buggers are keeping speed. Teed said, outright cheating that is, but gotta give them credit where credit is due. You saw that Ferrum? Yeah, didn't think I'd see that move anytime soon. Gods above, I need a bingo card for today for crazy speeder moves. You dumb fucks are pulling out all the stops. The gunner answered, keeping the turrets leveled at where the enemy's position would appear next. I didn't see anything, what are they doing? I said, trying to keep up with what was going on. Our own ship took a turn, this time rolling down into the canyon after the enemy's heels. That turn's too steep for a ship of that size to do it. Teed said, using his head to point since his hands were occupied. Feels completely off, their ass is too fat for that kind of maneuver. Except if they had an extra force to add in, yank them in the right direction. Look at the wall sides when we pass by. Our speeder crashed into the canyon floor, before rising back up, taking the turn with far more ease. I searched for what he'd explained as we passed through the narrow passage. All I see is ice and broken chunks of it off the walls. I said. Those chunks aren't all broken by them not fitting through. They're using the wall sides to slingshot themselves with docking hooks, that's why there's chunks of ice broken up by the walls. Keep your eyes peeled next time they're in range. Ahead, we got another look at the metal carrier. Our gunner opened fire while the enemy ship took another desperate turn, firing off a grappling hook into the ice cliff, using the taut metal rope to force the turn needed. A moment after, a turret on the enemy ship opened fire but not on us. Instead it was focused on the hook, shattering the ice and freeing up the hook again. See? Teed said. They're using the hooks to help them take sharp turns. And then getting it free from the wall the quick way. Smart. Getting lucky the force exerted on the line hasn't yet snapped the ice off the wall, that'd send them reeling. Despite the maneuver and docking thrusters running at max settings, the tail end of the enemy speeder still crushed hard against the ice, unable to fit well enough through. Ice chunks broke apart as the unyielding metal monster smashed its way through and continued forward with no damage. Their ship looked just as durable as ours. Think we should do the same? I asked, watching our prey vanish again behind another canyon entrance, fleeing the hail of weapon fire behind. We've got the better specs. Mobility's nearly twice the range, half the weight, and every engine is a good rank stronger. I can make this ship dance, they can just nod to the beat at best. Only thing they have on us is fuel economy, since my lady here was built to intercept and theirs was built to ferry cargo. The gunner cackled on the comms. Like a fat pig trying to outrun a cat by jumping off walls. Adorable, but it's dinner for us all the same. Our own ship reached the same spot, Teed twisting the ship once more into a nose tilt down, lifting the back end of the ship high up, while the ship gracefully slid through the turn. I heard a buckling sound, as our rear end must have collided against one of the overhanging ice bridges above the canyon. Gravity pushed me down, crates and boxes that hadn't been secured slid down the steep inclined cockpit, rattling away. See? They don't have the engine power to do a turn like this. The man made it look all so easy, but these kinds of turns were games of inches. If either of his control sticks were just slightly off, the entire turn would have ended way worse. Status? Shadow Song asked over the comms as the ship leveled again. The ship's been buckling, are we under threat? No sir, just some aggressive maneuvers. Teed replied stone calm. We're already nipping at their heels, just need a good bite to hamstring them. He cut the comms, switching them back to interior ones. You hear that, Ferrum? Go do your job already, I'm pulling my part. The gunner gave only a scoff, while the turrets tracked our prey. Ahead we could see the fat airspeeder we were after. They'd tried to take another turn and must have overshot it. Instead of committing, they'd hooked themselves back into a straight line and were making a run for it. Our ship opened fire again, the turret shots scattering across the enemy hull, lighting up with a few hundred sparks, right by their vector thrusters. Something finally gave on their side, smoke billowing out. There was a whooping over the comms, hope you got a plate ready. Ferrum said, now tell me I'm not doing my part again, you little shit. Teed flicked to the general setting, opening the channel again to the knights. Prepare for boarding. We got them. Heads up, it won't be on flat ground, make sure your boots are magnetized to stick. Who knows what kind of stunts these guys are willing to pull with an airspeeder that's not theirs. Understood. All knights, move. Shadow Song called out. Bay doors opened up on my console panel, and I could hear the relic armor knights taking footholds, climbing out to cover the sides of our ship. A boom rang out, followed by a second. The undersider ship had used its heavy cannons to open fire, directly onto the ice walls, right under one of the frozen bridge arcs. The whole thing groaned, cracking apart before falling down. They were trying to stop us from passing by. Teed cursed loudly. All crew, brace. I'm about to get disrespectful, he said over the comms, hands flying over his controls. The ship lumbered to the offside of the chasm, picking up speed. Heading straight for the falling debris. No, not straight, the ship was getting closer and closer to the ice walls on our right. Pilot! Shadowsong barked out from his position outside, hanging on the hull and now very aware of the kind of driving Teed was doing. His voice came up again, sounding far more panicked. Pilot! Teed flipped a few levers and the ship began to lower closer to the ground. Farum, angel roll, hook shot on starboard side, don't miss, he said. The boss is watching. The gunner gave another scoff. I know the drill already, just shut up and let me focus. Teed didn't answer, instead putting the entire ship into a spin, lighting up the thrusters on our side. The whole ship began to shift over on itself to the left slowly. Repulsion started to affect the sides of the walls, and right as we approached the debris wall, he cranked the hover engines to maximum, while flaring out the vector thrusters on the left side. The result was our entire airship launching itself over the broken debris, all the while spinning on itself. Halfway into the air, completely upside down, Farum opened fire with both a right-bound hook shot at the ice, and 2 turrets. The right hook hit the walls, and began to retract, forcing the airspeeder to complete the spin right before the whole ship landed. Turret shots had been split into 2 directions. One already freeing up the hook, letting it retract back into place. The second turret was opening fire right at the exposed undersider ship, as if it was business as usual. The weight of our ship dragged everything down as inertia overcame the ship's hovering power for a moment, ice scraping the bottom of the airspeeder again as we came out of the crouch. And that's bingo! Farum grunted out. I'd never seen or even heard of an airspeeder doing this, I said, feeling my blood pool back into my feet. Well, I'm having a ball here. My kind of music, Teed said, resetting the system back to default. Everyone's always so focused on the knights fighting with their little metal sticks, the real entertainment is being slept on. God's damned shame it is. Our turrets continued the relentless barrage, like dotted lines of yellow connecting our ship to theirs. Their own ship had stopped returning fire, either from damage or lack of manpower. The enemy airspeeder's primary engine sputtered from our onslaught, having lost another critical part. More whooping on the comms from Farum, along with a few choice obscenities. The wounded ship tried making the next turn, only to crash hard against the ice wall, bouncing it slowly back out where it failed to keep itself right end. We were rapidly approaching it head-on now. They're not using hooks anymore, I asked, watching the ship try to wiggle through a new turn, like a consolation prize after having failed to make the better choice. Got their heavy turrets with that last volley of the light anti-armor rounds, the gunner said, with unmistakable pride. First thing I aimed for. They can't free any of their hooks if they try their cute maneuvers out now. I could see undersider knights climbing on the top part of the enemy airspeeder now, using their boots to stick to the metal while the ship buckled under them like a wild beast, trying to recenter itself and go down the canyon proper. They were preparing for the inevitable boarding. Teed caught up in range a moment later, opening fire with a grappling hook right at the enemy ship. The shot connected, digging into the superstructure and expanding out. The 3 undersider knights on top reacted immediately, occult blades turning on as they scaled the sides of their ship, desperate to reach and cut the line. Not going to save you. Chicken's already cooked, Teed muttered, moving our ship closer, using the hook shot as guidance. We were close enough to see the details of the behemoth. Like a fish hooked on a reel. It struggled, but there was no heart in it anymore. All right, my job's done, Teed said, leaning back on his chair. A moment later, heavy footfalls sounded above the cockpit and I saw Shadowsong along with others leap off our ship, across the distant expanse between our ships, and land directly against the sides of the enemy ship. Occult blades flared out and Shadow Song instantly pushed the few enemy knights back, away from the hook. More of our knights leaped off, taking point next to Shadow Song. There wasn't much of a fight at this point. Shadow Song and my house knights had pummeled the Undersiders into submission almost immediately, after a slight hiccup where one of our knights nearly lost footing as the enemy ship tilted for another turn. A moment later, all the three defenders were being held down against the ground, while our knights had swung into the enemy airspeeder, right through the bay doors. The speeder continued its trajectory for a few dozen seconds before beginning to slow down. Teed matched the speed, letting the enemy ship go back into a far more peaceful stride. The ship slowed down further, finding a spot wide enough for multiple airspeeders to land. From there, it came out of the hover and crunched down lightly on the ice ground. Teed followed suit, bringing his own ship to rest. Comms from the carrier opened up. "Frigate secured," one of my knights said. "Hostages are all alive and were left locked up in the inner airlock. We've captured all the Undersider knights alive, only 5 aboard. 2 driving, 3 outside. Well, guess the rest of them really did expect me to be hiding back at the clan, all nice and safe somewhere they could ambush me. Now we've got their ship, 5 of their knights knocked out into the snow and more armor under our banner. Plus their boss was not in good shape, last I saw him. It seems my impulsive need to get into the thick of it has, for once, turned out in my favor. Time to order up fish and properly gloat about it." Book 3, Chapter 18, Fishing for Trouble. "Oi! I met your boss." Legis turned his head to the sound, eyes meeting my own. Chains kept his arms tied, though they were loose enough for him to sit in reasonable comfort. "The feather?" he asked, in the gloom of his cell. The door behind me creaked shut while the guards beyond took their post, leaving me alone with the chosen priest. Well, as alone as I could be with Cathita in the background. Yab. Pale fellow. Long white braid, thinks he's great with a spear, walks around with sandals and a toga. Violet eyes, and a metal hand that's made of floating pieces, plus that oversized shoulder tower wall thing he's got going. And the cape. Can't forget the cape. Ring any bell? I asked, walking over and setting up a seat right before him. On the other hand, I offered him a pear. Hungry? His hand reached out, chains clanking noisily at the motion. He took the fruit, biting into it with little fanfare. A quick nod in thanks, and the man focused on chewing slowly, savoring it. Food likely hadn't been very good down here in the dark. You have no need to be dramatic, Winterscar. There can be hardly anyone else you speak of given that description. And given that you're here and alive, I take it you somehow managed to defeat that demon. Not a fan of him? Curious, I thought you worshipped the machines. He shook his head at that. My faith is my own, as I've told you before. I know the danger they pose. There was a look in his eye at that, something I couldn't quite put my hand on. I'm guessing he wasn't very polite to you either. The first time I met that feather, he killed a child. I paused. What? Legis rattled his chain slightly, taking another bite instead of answering and chewing for a moment, eyes closed. A little boy who'd been playing nearby. He finally said. The ball crossed his pass, and the feather simply stabbed his hand through the child's heart, and then cut his throat without pause. Didn't look, or seem to care at all. As if he's acted only on instinct, hardly aware of it. The only machine type that wears our form, in the most idealized manner, is the truest monster of them all. While the rank and file, those machines that wear a twisted nightmare of our form, all skulls and bones. Why, they end up being far more harmless. Outright curious, I could claim. Perhaps it may strike you as odd, but the rank and file machines were far more agreeable to us. Like children themselves. Only the drakes seemed to watch us with an echo of the hatred that Tuekar did. Another bite into the fruit. I let him chew and swallow before I asked again. If you want to help me put an end to him, I could use any information you might know. If you'd helped me earlier from the start, I might have put him into the ground permanently. Don't make the same mistake twice. Legis raised his arm, shaking the chains locked around his wrist. I've balanced my duty to my people with my duty to the machines that hold my people's lives. I won't apologize for omitting information or being obtuse, though I hardly had to bend any truths thus far. Ask what you will. I'll answer what I can. I shrugged, taking it in stride. What do you know of Tuekar, now that you seem to be in such an agreeable mood to share? He took another bite of his fruit, chewing on it casually. I respect his power and rank, but I share little love for his temperament. If anything, I'm rather happy hearing he's been defeated. You need to be more specific with what you want me to inform you about. I do not know how you intend to fight him, or what weaknesses you are searching for. All right, let's start at the basics. Tell me what this feather is. What's he want with me? What's he want with you? He stopped, swallowed, and looked me in the eye. Why would he care about you? He is an emissary of the machine goddess, and not a favored one at that. He failed the lady in some way, and now as atonement, he'd been sent to deal with us. We are below his level, and he's made that blindingly clear many times over. As I mentioned, my first meeting with him was not a peaceful one. Did your own first sight of him match? First time I saw him, he monologued at Lord Atius for a bit, and threatened to kill us all. Technically he did win the duel, but it wasn't in the way he'd end up happy. Was that the failure the lady took personally? Legis shrugged. I've never heard him speak about Lord Atius, nor any fights with him. Up to now, he's only shown concern with completing the lady's missions. For whatever reasons she sees fit. We've spoken only a few times, and each time it had been to give me orders to complete. I don't think he even knows my name. I am not a person to Tuekar, only a tool. I don't think any of the chosen register as individuals. So you don't know why he's after me exactly. He shook his head in genuine confusion. Rather, this is the first I've ever heard of him care about a human in any regard. If I had my hunches, I suspect it's an order from the lady. That's the only reason he would stoop to dealing with humans. But that just makes even less sense. If you couldn't be in Tuekar's sights by natural means, then what hope do you have of being on the Pale Lady's own sights? All right, things were starting to point to my initial theory. This had something to do with the bunker, and the discussion I had with Psuya. What's he want with the surface? Again the priest shrugged. He had been given an order by the lady to convert as many humans as possible. Pilgrimage was to start with the surface dwellers, so we were dispatched up there. He paused for a moment. You should know he cannot die. Like a deathless, destroying his body will only stop him for a few days at most until he has a new one made. I don't mean to try and rob you of your victory. But he will be back, and he will seek revenge 100-fold greater. Killing him might have been the worst thing you could have done. And yet you followed someone like that. It was that or death. Between both options, I think you might understand why I chose the former. He took a last bite of the fruit, consuming it whole. How did you kill him? I shrugged. He tried to attack me personally, separate me from my crew. And I politely told him to fuck off. Legis laughed. By politely, I assume with a sword? But how exactly did you defeat him? The feather is many things, weak is not a word I would use to describe him. His arrogance. I took advantage of his arrogance. The priest nodded, as if my one-word answer solved everything. I could certainly see him fall for that. That pride was not unfounded, however. I was told he was over 500 years old, and all those years were spent in combat. He certainly moved like a monster from ancient times. How did you match him at all? That's for me to know, and if you're lucky, you'll never find out either. He paused. Then nodded. Perhaps ignorance is preferable. I have a feeling it wouldn't be healthy to know your secrets. After all, they brought down the attention of a feather. Did you get everything you wanted to know? Your knights. I've taken out to Ekar, and captured the returning airspeeder, but there's still knights unaccounted for. Where are they? He shrugged. That, I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that my captain is meticulous, and I don't think he'll stop. Not with who's at stake for him if he fails. We all fight for something, or someone. If their goal was to capture you in the first place, then he will not stop just for this. You need to prepare. There was a knock on the door. Master Winterscar, the clan lord's shinobis have arrived and are going to be interrogating the priest. Respectfully, sir, your time is up. Forgive us, but we cannot bend the rules more for you than we already have. Well, you never saw me if anyone asks, I said, winking at him as I stood up. He smiled, the sort of enigmatic smile of a doomed man. Were it be so simple. Thank you for the fruit. I appreciate the kindness. Good luck to you, Winterscar, and may your gods watch over you. Perhaps we will speak again someday, in another life. Ellie swirled the wine in her glass, watching as the pale liquid moved. Don't consider me ungrateful, but while I appreciate the wine, I'm not quite sure this glass is worth getting shot in the leg another time. We've only been here 5 minutes, there hasn't even been any screaming or shooting yet. Night's still young, I said, taking a sip of my own glass. Under the balcony we sat at, the clan was busy trying to dance away their stress. House Revenal, an agri-farmer house, had gone all in on the decorations in a desperate attempt to lighten the mood. Vines of all kinds had been set up, and some of them even had been stuffed with vegetables, as if we were in the middle of a wild untamed vertical farm that had been left a few years to its own ideas. Not sure how they pulled it off, but I had to hand it to them. The place breathed of life. Ellie, on the other hand, was still nervous about her own life. I really should be asking to get paid for this. Snarky compliments and a cheap glass of wine just don't have that same charm they used to. I might be amendable, depends on what the services included. How far are you committed to customer satisfaction? Are we talking full service here or only a massage? A piece of sticky rice flew off directly into my face as a response. I knew you were secretly swine on the inside, she said, rolling her eyes. Mother always warned me about boys like you. And yet, here I am anyhow. I just keep doing it to myself at this point. The waiter came by, dropping 2 plates of freshly cooked surface staples. The smell wafted over, tickling my nose. We family disappointments stick together, you know? Only natural, I said, stretching back on the chair and listening to the music. Besides, pigs can be pretty cute. And clever. Give me a bit of credit. And true to my nature, I set in on the main dish before me. Giant isopodan bug stir, complete with spicy peanut sauce and sticky rice. The massive pill bug had been overturned on the back of its shell, while the meat inside had been carefully detached, cooked up with seasoning, and then decoratively returned into the shell. This one had been an enormous little bugger, probably weighing at 2 or 3 pounds. I ripped a piece of the steaming rice, rolled it into a ball, and used it to scoop up some of the broiled insect meat, dipping it right into the peanut sauce after. Spice and flavor with each bite. Wonderful. Ellie snapped off one of the legs off her own isopodan, and waggled it at me like a stick. See, there's a problem with that plan of yours, oh my cute and clever pig. She took a quick pause to suck up the meat inside, tossing the little leg back on her plate, empty. If I were the Undersiders, I'd take one look at all this, you being here unarmored and alone, and I'd call it bait. I'd be screaming it left and right to anyone in earshot. And, guess what? I'd be right. Because I'm not an idiot. Who's to say my main plan is just to fish for Undersider nights? I could just be enjoying a night out with a friend and eating some of my favorite food, taking a break from that armor. You don't know me. Please. I'd bet my last stockings that half your house guards are hiding away in armor somewhere obvious, like the roofing. And the other half are hiding behind the curtains, with their little toes sticking out. She said, wiggling her fingers at me with her free hand. First, you wouldn't see their toes, they have boots. Second, don't think I don't notice the bait. You start throwing out hot words like stockings around here, expecting me to be some kind of chauvinistic pig and zero in on that, but I am not going to fall for it. Nope. I am the model of a gentleman. I paused for a moment. Are they the black ones though? The defense rests. She said, hand extended as if she'd proved a point. That said, we should put a damper on the flirting, as much fun as it's been. I've gotten some serious proposals lately, all thanks to you. I might actually decide to have that arrangement, in truth this time. Alas, I sighed, the back of my hand going to my forehead while I looked away dramatically. Our budding love was never to be. Such a tragedy. Destined to freeze. She finished. Just as dramatically. It's almost as if we've grown older since our younger days. Perhaps we've become, dare I say it, responsible and respectable people. Responsible? No. But respectable. I wagged a finger at her, eyes shining. Also no. And on the topic of respectable people, who's the unlucky man you managed to con this time? She hummed, waiting for a moment. As if thinking about it. While she played up the theatrics, I served myself another glass of wine and took a nice gulp. I only realized halfway through she'd been waiting for me to take a sip. Oh, he's from this little retainer house. Very quaint. They call themselves Winterscars. You might have heard of them. I choked on my drink for a moment, and gave her a stare. You serious? You incurable flirt, not even the guards from my own house are safe. As funny as it would be, I do have at least some tact left, so no, I'm just getting a rise out of you this time. There's a lot of people to sort through, that part I wasn't lying on. And all of them are after my ties to you, so that's put a damper on prospects. I even got one from House Shadow Song, of all houses. You're both a blessing and a curse, you know that. At this point, I just want these undersiders to show up and save me from this topic. Please, I'll take a bullet to my leg even. I think it's my turn now, right? Or can we skip to the part where I'm permanently uninvited from the wedding again? I'd like to stick to tradition. Pick another topic if you don't like the gossip, there's plenty to go around. Your loss, I have some hilarious stories from this. What's the word about Winterscar? I've recently put a target on my head when I kept all that armor, but my head has been firmly under a glacier. Bell-like laughing came from her. Oh, the houses are absolutely livid. Let me paint you the picture. Right after you come back from the underground, House Winterscar starts its mass expansion campaign, poaching and swiping up all kinds of talent. Either from the houseless, or from other houses directly. Kedra gave not a single frick about that. Best gossip in years. She grinned. And then you came into the picture. Shadow Song himself starts to follow you around like a guard dog right after your sister leaves with Anka. Which I'll remind you, guarding someone on his own volition is something he's only ever done for his daughter. He's notorious for being an overprotective parent. I can already imagine the rumors from that bit adding it all together. I groaned. Another bite, another swallow, another sip. She was taking her time to tell me the news. So of course, everyone suspects Shadow Zong's arranged a marriage between Anka and yourself. Why else would he suddenly be so protective of you unless you were going to become his son-in-law pretty soon? I think the disgust on my face gave a little too much away. I see that particular rumor's not completely true then. She said, nodding as if everything made sense. At least, it's not something that'll come from your wheelhouse. What exactly do you mean by that? I asked, a little weary. Think about it from Shadowzong's point of view. Is there anyone else in the clan that he respects enough to allow his daughter's hand at this moment? I gulped, realizing the implications. Well, that doesn't change all that much, she said, barreling past any arguments before I could say them. The houses are already sure the two strongest and most powerful houses in the clan are about to get politically tied up in a possible merge, doesn't matter if it would actually happen or not. This is where the clan lord should have stepped in and helped balance things out. And instead I get a writ of full passage for anything I want. She snapped her fingers. Exactly. Now all the houses are beyond spooked. Something's gone real bad if Lord Atius is breaking his famed neutrality to push a powerhouse up the ranks. Nobody knows what the endgame goal is. Then the raiders pop up, and try to take you out. Now if people aren't suspecting the Chosen for being behind that, they're suspecting each other as a desperate attempt to break up the gathered power. It's a complete mess in the background, and you're probably completely oblivious to it all, aren't you? Well, she wasn't wrong there. I'd been spending my time training Captain Sagrius and his band of merry murder knights how to protect me from future shenanigans. Little did I know the absolute zoo that was secretly happening under my nose. And I called myself a Winterscar. How the mighty have fallen. And now we enter Lady Drass, who is impartial, a Logi, and had been specifically elected because she wasn't Shadowsong and wasn't supposed to be involved in all of this Winterscar Shadowsong takeover. The people's hero, that would sweep in, revoke all these absurd power-ups, force you both to auction out some of your earned armors in order to restore balance to the clan. Well, that didn't work out like they'd thought, I said, slurping down the rest of the flaky pillbug meat and drinking it down with another healthy gulp of wine. Absolutely did not. Not only did Lady Drass not revoke your writ of passage, she expanded it. Winterscars get to keep all the armors they collected, and Shadowsongs are the ones forced to auction out some of their armors to the lesser houses. Her own first blade wasn't exempt to the rules, but you, a random house by all means, were. And worse, she refused to elaborate on why, keeping it all a secret. Not to mention the bigger secret of how so many slaver knights got butchered once they stepped into the Winterscar compound. You got hit by an entire army that would have crippled any other clan, and somehow you're the only one walking out of it with hardly a scratch. Her chopsticks speared out some more bits of seeming meat off her plate, to which she washed down with some of the sticky rice. And none of the Winterscars are saying a single thing about it, they're like a vice grip that's been sealed shut. Right down to the lesser servants. Nobody knows what the hell's going on inside House Winterscar, but the request for 300 occult blade replicas really didn't help at all. Rumor mill must be having an aneurysm. What's your bets? She leaned back, thinking for a moment. You've got some kind of super weapon you brought out from underground. And you, specifically you, managed to fix it up. Don't hide it, you little scraphead. I know you've got a knack for engineering. If there's one person who's got a chance of bringing back something from the golden era working, it's you. The 300 occult swords are a smokescreen. You're having a giggle at the other houses by freaking them out with all kinds of scrap shit jobs to hide what you've really uncovered. But whatever it is, it's got to be some kind of legendary artifact, a relic from the War of the Gods or something. No way that many enemy relic knights could have been knocked out by you. I'm putting my bets it's some ancient imperial artifact, considering you came back to the surface with a crusader's armor. No comment, I said, waving for the waiter to bring the bill. Of course you'd say that. Anyhow, that leads me right back to this little stunt of yours tonight. The Undersider Knights aren't going to be showing up. Frankly, if I were them, I'd be putting as many doors, walls, and continents between you and I as I possibly could. You're not going to see even a hair of them try to pull the same stunt that ruined the slavers. They'll know all the same things I do, it's not exactly hidden away in someone's files. You're terrifying. Nobody wants to mess with you. Legis said his captain wouldn't bow out. But Ellie was making a convincing case that he would. Especially since I did take out to Ekar, which probably puts me one level above just terrifying. I wondered what I would have done had I been in their shoes. How would I have tried to capture myself given the resources available? The game was utterly stacked against them right now. I guess it was a little much to expect the Undersiders to jump at the bit for me here. And Ellie was right, since for the rest of the night, I saw no sign of them. Which was perfectly fine with me, as I had the most relaxing night in the past few months. Captain Sagrius, who was indeed hiding in a slightly less obvious spot than the roofing, along with the rest of the Winterscar knights all sulking around in their own carefully prepared hiding spots, well, he probably didn't have as much a good night as I had. So if they won't come to me, I'll need to hunt them down instead. But it was nice to know I could now spend some time away from my armor and enjoy sleeping on a bed again. The newfound confidence really did a number on the paranoid thoughts and nightmares I'd been dealing with since the raid. That feeling of not being completely safe in my own estate grounds was swiftly going away with scheduled medicine and meditation. Sagrius and I will have to go explore the underground tunnels tomorrow, see if we can find any tracks of the Undersiders. It's been some time since I've done a full delve underground. Maybe I should take a few more days to relax first before I jumped into the fire again. I haven't taken a bath in forever after all. Book 3, Chapter 19, Interlude, Captain Sagrius. Ah, she said, not looking up from her keyboard as her hands flew over the keys. You must be the Winterscar. Captain Sagrius stepped forward. He kept his movements fluid, one step behind the young master. Two of his best flanked directly behind, making a group of 3 knights to escort the acting Winterscar Prime. The youth took a few more steps forward and then dropped to one knee as decorum dictated. Clan Lord Drass. You've summoned me. She nodded, typing away still. Sagrius had heard of her. Well respected among the Logi, though he knew little of what the Logi considered respectable or not. Temporary clan lord, until Lord Atius returns for the seat. She said. And indeed I have summoned you. It's about time we had a talk. One last keystroke, and she was clearly done with whatever task was at hand. Lady Drass was old, possibly in her 70s, past the age of retirement for a retainer. Unless perfectly well maintained, the body would become a liability out in the field. A scavenger could continue for some time at her age, but a knight would have long ago passed down his armor. Indeed, the Logi must have different metrics for ability. Small reading glasses perched by a wrinkled nose, fading blonde hair, with hundreds of white hairs sprouting across her hairline. The eyes though, those were sharp and lucid. The captain recognized eyes like those. The sort of gaze that had intensity and made him think she trained her mind the same way retainers trained their bodies. She waved away at the 2 clan knights that stood inside the room, her own personal bodyguards. You 2 may go. The knights in turn gave a salute, turned and left. The strongest sign of trust a clan lord could offer any subordinate, to allow them to retain their own entourage while foregoing her own. When I inherited this position, you were an enigma, Winterscar. She said. Lord Atius has famously taken great lengths to avoid showing any sign of favoritism, besides a few handful of low-hanging fruit, such as giving budding talent a nudge or stage to showcase what they could do. And then you come into the picture. A writ of full passage, signed by him. Do you know the last time he has done such a thing? The young master shook his head. Sagrius didn't know himself either. Clan history was long and steeped in heroic stories of people, rather than the events that surrounded them. Small details like this would probably be found in a compendium, which wasn't required reading. Keith may have had a chance at knowing, the boy had often surprised Sagrius with knowledge far outside the ken of a retainer, but in this instance it seemed both of them were in the dark. Never. The answer is never. This is the first time he's ever written a writ such as this. It only theoretically existed, inherited from clan law of the original composing clans that banded together to form what we have now. You may have not noticed the stir you caused, after all, no one would stand directly to your face and ask questions. Instead, the rest of us had to guess at it. She hummed, fixing the glasses back on the bridge of her nose while the boy seemed to flinch with guilty thoughts. Many of us assumed you had somehow discovered a weapon of some kind that would turn the tides of the coming war. Imagine their disappointment, when none of your house members revealed anything. Many of them instead outright lied, giving false trails or ideas. They'd clearly prepared ahead of time. She gave a curt glance to the captain, and the two other that loitered behind like shadows. Zagreus refrained from smiling, keeping a face at all times. He was proud of his new house. Of the people he worked with. They all rallied together with a single mind, often not needing to even speak to one another to know what needed to be done. The Lady Kedra had chosen well. All his life he'd trained for the chance at becoming a knight. Houseless at the start, a little boy with too many dreams and too many stories he'd read. His excellent skills and hard effort had pushed him past his peers in his youth. He'd earned a spot in House Icewing, a minor house that held only one relic armor. Still, he held that spark of ambition in his heart, to become one of the knights that wielded the relic armor Icewing. Years had gone by, and despite his dedication, others were elevated before him. Skill alone wasn't enough to distinguish him above those who had been born into the house. He grew frustrated, and disillusioned. And then Lady Kedra had appeared, and offered him a new path. Many of the houses did a deep dive into your past, trying to discover why someone who they had previously never even heard of, would suddenly rise. The clan lord said, taking a critical look at the kneeling youth. To the agri-farmers, and lesser castes, you are considered a hero. Did you know that? They see your background, an outcast who spent more of his time among the streets than in the high and mighty retainer caste. To see you rise above even the greatest of your kind is the sort of victory the common folk rally around. To your own caste, you stand as an uneasy reality, that the natural order of things has been turned and with no reason they could think of. Indeed, the natural order of things had stagnated. The two siblings had seen the rot from the outside and purged it away. The Lady Kedra with her surgical glare and demand for excellence, and the younger sibling, Master Keith, with a gentle helping hand, friendly to all no matter their rank. Such a change from his old house, where the masters hardly even known he existed. The other houses would do well to follow the example set by House Winterscar. But it was not Zagreus's place to bring that up, that fight was someone else's fate. The old Logi's eyes once more glanced up at the three Winterscar knights, taking keen measure. Your guards, how much are they aware of? Everything. Keith answered. I didn't spare any detail I didn't know. Figured it'd be better if we're all on the same level ground. Plus now I get to make all kinds of inside jokes, which is probably the best perk in all this. What a day that had been, when Master Keith had brought him and the rest of the knights into his sanctuary, to share with them the secrets he'd plumbed out. At the start, Zagreus had seen Keith as the kind master of House Winterscar, the adolescent soul and heart of the house. While the elder more mature sister was the blade and mind behind it. That all vanished the moment he'd seen the first duel between sister and brother. Zagreus doubted his entire life's work right then and there. Here were two juniors, one he was more than twice the age of, and yet they fought on a completely different league than he ever could. Had his skills simply been a delusion? Was this what real skill had been like this whole time? No wonder House Icewing had been such a minor house, if this was the skill level of true knights. The older servants of House Winterscar had helped him through that loss of confidence. No, they told him, the young master had never been that quick before. Not until he brought back that cursed crusader's armor. And neither had the sister, but she moved just as quick now, while wielding the same armor the house had sheltered for decades. Something else had been brought back from the underground, and the two siblings were making full use of it. He hadn't been in that courtyard when Master Keith had walked in, armored up. But his men spoke in hushed tones of that day. Zagreus could imagine well enough. Being cornered by enemy knights, knowing there was no winning move possible, attempting simply to delay. Knowing that so long as Master Keith could get to his armor, he would come back with his skill and speed and turn the tides of this war. Holding tight to that single ray of hope, fighting off against mad power-crazed men, wreathed in indestructible armor. And then the hope was validated. Keith had strode into that courtyard and done exactly what every soldier had been praying for. Zagreus hadn't been there to witness the moment, but he could understand why the soldiers revered the young master with a higher intensity than they had shown even Lady Kedra, the true prime of House Winterscar. Things would become very ugly and muddled if Keith ever decided to challenge Kedra for leadership. The house would become utterly split. And while Zagreus didn't expect that kind of foolish mistake from the people he'd sworn his oaths to, such things were common among the great houses. The clan lord motioned the young master to stand back up, and take a seat. Drass walked slowly, not with a limp, but clearly taking her time as she sat down on a seat nearby. Zagreus gave a quick head tilt, ordering the other two guards to flank behind. "I'm not sure you realize the depth of what you've done and created, young man," Drass said, as the captain and his men took defensive positions to guard both. "Take the armor you have modified with the soul fractal as an example. Do you know that they will be forever modified that way? Granting the wielder access to a new school of combat that puts any elite knight at the same level as that of a deathless. These are no longer regular relic armor. It is inevitable that they will each become legendary armaments, of which I have no doubt entire wars will be fought over for a single one. Long after we're all dead and buried, those armors will live on. Your swords with crossguards offer counter options no warlock blades could. And the night breakers alone are more a weapon on the level of the deathless, rather than mere knights in combat. That you fought off a feather with such a weapon and survived the encounter proves that. You know about Tuekar?" Keith asked. "The feather?" Zagreus hadn't ever seen one in person, only heard the legends. The video footage Keith had shared did the stories justice. Drass just nodded slowly. "Shadowsong is my first blade. I trust him to bring me information pertinent to my position, and he's done so correctly for now. So then, to the topic at hand, you understand that what you're dabbling in has a far larger scale than you might consider? A few hundred years from now, our clan name might be nothing more than a forgotten name. But the name of the forge smith Keith Winterscar, and the relic armors and weapons he forged, those will be remembered. People will spend their lifetime trying to track down who you were, what you did, and where more of your treasures might lay buried away. You know, this isn't going to help my ego at all, right?" Drass laughed, the old elderly version. No, it would not. But your ego is something we need to discuss. Given the scope you dally in, why are you wasting your time with the chosen knights?" Keith stumbled. "Pardon," he said, almost sounding like someone caught in a crime. "I know you're trying to ferret them out. Perhaps out of pride, since they are trying to claim your life after all. It's only natural to attempt to retaliate yourself. In any other situation, I would have left them to retainers to handle this, leaving Shadowsong to bring order and handle military affairs. It would have been his decision to let you continue. But, as I have stated before, you are on a different level. I've brought you here specifically to give you direct orders. You will cease the search for the Undersider Knights and allow Shadowsong to take care of that issue. Instead, I directly order you to train with both your knights and a selection of other knights that have been previously granted the Winter Blossom technique. The chosen knights will be ferreted out, but lesser knights will be dedicated to the task. What I need is a fighting force of knights that can eliminate the incoming raiders. I need that more than I need the chosen knights hunted down and their armors taken." Zagreus agreed with the clan lord internally. The chosen knights were scum that had forfeited their rights as guests, spat on the laws and traditions of hospitality in poor faith. But between hunting them down, or seeing the young master be trained further in combat, there was hardly any debate in his mind. He felt his armor's soul stir slightly, moving lethargically within its own soul fractal. It could feel familiar feelings, and that was drawing it out just slightly. The young master had often talked in length about soul fractals, the soul sight, and how each person seemed to have their own variations of it. Zagreus had felt nothing unique just yet, but there was something he'd been doing that hadn't been spoken of often. His armor. It spoke to him in the same monotone, only ever giving reports. When he'd first donned the relic, he'd assumed it to be like a pseudo-smart AI. Golden tech era. Then he'd touched the soul fractal and his world had expanded. Deep within the chest of his armor, the true soul of the armor rested. He reached a probing hand out for it, and felt the connection. An old and ancient soul, moving like a river of ice. It neither welcomed him, nor chased him off. It was a vast mountain, and what would the mountain care for any deer that scurried upon its back? But lately, it had begun to recognize him more and more. The old spirit had no means of speaking, not by words, but it could by feelings. The first time Zagreus had touched on this soul was the first time he'd see what true loyalty was. The armor was utterly dedicated to the effort of protecting him. And only him. It did not care who he was, what he had done, or even if he was worthy of protection. It only cared to protect, and that desire ran so deep Zagreus could not possibly see or understand the depth of it. But he wanted to. The old soul may be the mountain, and he might be the deer, but the entire mountain had moved to shape itself around, just to offer the right amount of shade. He was a knight now. His entire life had been validated, all his struggles had led him to this moment, where he stood among legends and myth. Now that he had acquired that terrible power, it needed a purpose. He needed a new goal. Power hadn't been the only thing he'd found at the summit of his life. Standing there, slightly hunched over, with a carefree grin, had been Master Keith. The small urchin. And now, the forge master who'd crafted creations that even the clan lord had immediately understood would outlive all of them. The gods had put Zagreus here on this path for a reason. This boy would change the world. Zagreus could feel it in his bones. All the knights of House Winterscar could. But the boy needed to be protected. This is why the gods had granted him his skills and talents. Strength without purpose was useless. His journey to become a knight was only the starting point of his true mission. The armor stirred again, feeling a kindred spirit nearby. An echo of what drove it. Zagreus reached out to the old soul, absent-mindedly, almost in meditation while he remained alert for danger, senses probing out. He'd been doing that more and more often as of late whenever he practiced the winter blossom technique, finding the ancient spirit fascinating. Calming too. Like a deep lukewarm bath, the depth of that single-minded loyalty something to be admired. The connection took, and held, the armor glancing over his own soul with slow movements. It had never once cared who the owner had been, its only purpose had been to protect the owner. But today, it had felt a pang of something too familiar for it to look away. The armor blinked. And then it let go, curiosity sated, receding back into the soul fractal, a slow lumbering giant. Light fading feelings of approval trailing behind it. He took off his helmet, breathing the semi-warmed air. Water was nearby and the captain drank greedily from it. 3 days of diligent training. 3 entire days, spent in the hidden sanctum of House Winterscar. Now given the single-minded purpose to train using the winter blossom technique, ideas and inspirations he and his men had slowly been considering were laid bare, and then optimized by the armors. He and the Winterscar Knights had been joined by other elites from the different houses. Men and women Zagreus knew by name, from sheer reputation. People who he'd never have once thought to ever share the same room with. Now they trained with him side by side, pooling their vast experience in combat. The result had been exceptional. The new school of combat had been named Rockerai, the lightning style. Apt name given the speed of each technique within the small selection of movements for the first generation. 9 perfect movements that countered and defeated all of the surface styles, in every situation. Only usable by knights wielding the winter blossom. The process had started backwards. They needed a counter set against all the known surface styles, which the raiders would approach with. 3 known schools of combat. So 3 countersets were created. Each counterset needed multiple forms to handle different situations. 3 forms were deemed enough. Thus 9 forms in total to handle every school. The first form in each counterset was the basic one, usable in all situations with any manner of weapon, but it required the most movements and killed the slowest. The second form in each counterset was optimized for a long sword wielder. Far quicker than the first form's more basic methods, and could be executed from a neutral stance, still capable of adapting to any motion from the enemy. The last form was a counterattack. Hyper-specialized, it killed the fastest and was the most deadly of all 3 forms. By the half-second mark, the attack became utterly unblockable and death was all but assured. But it required more than just a simple longsword. The third form required 2 longswords forged with Master Keith's crossguards. More forms would be created eventually, but for now, the knights had all agreed 3 motions for each surface school was enough to begin with. Zagreus had been proud to have invented 2 of the current 9 forms that comprised the current iteration of the Rockeri style. The most challenging one had been the basic first form capable of dealing with the water-style opponent. The sheer number of permutations and movements capable of that opponent truly highlighted how fine-tuned the combat arts had been taken to. In comparison, their lightning style was far more crude and direct. A simple set of motions that should never have been able to work, if speed was still a factor. When the fight against the raiders came, Zagreus could imagine the regular rank and file approach. The true threat to the civilians and the clan itself. Far too many for knights like him to hunt down and fully exterminate. No, they had to be cowed into surrender. And there would be no better tool than to have those enemy soldiers watch their fearsome knights get butchered in seconds, by a secret technique the world had never seen before. As the days passed and the technique was practiced and perfected, the captain's spirits soared up. The knights could feel victory in the air. But the young master's own thoughts grew distant. Troubled. The Lady Kedra had been expected to return within these days. And each day, Keith contacted the Logie Tower, asking for whereabouts. Each time, the answer had been unknown. Something had happened underground. And so Zagreus trained harder than he ever had before in his life. He knew in his bones, he would need this new school of combat. Every ounce of experience training with it. The Winterscar knights could all feel it. Soon, the young master would set out for his sister. The boy said nothing of it, made no mention other than to follow the orders of the clan lord. But Zagreus knew this was inevitable. And the chosen knights would follow behind, without a doubt. Like dogs chasing down blood. At one point, Captain Zagreus would have considered himself a loyal man to the clan above all. The thought of abandoning the clan at the time of a raider invasion would have been the deepest heresy, especially with relics. But lately his senses of loyalty had been displaced. Refocused. The clan would survive. The Winterscar knights were not the only ones with knowledge of the Rockeri techniques. The clan had been given blades, and the Nightbreakers, along with the Shadow Song Prime himself to lead them into battle. The boy needed to be protected more. The armor's spirit stirred once more as he drank his water and set it aside. It had never tried to protect more than one person. To the armor, purpose was singular. Loyalty diluted was no loyalty at all. Zagreus felt his spirit slowly align with that, and ever so slightly, he peered deeper into the depth of that armor's soul. Despite all his progress, that depth of purpose always seemed endless. His mind withdrew, back into the material world. He watched the young masters spar with the elites. Skills had increased tremendously now that only his intellect was required when fighting. If the boy became too agitated about his sister's disappearance, there wasn't telling what he could do on impulse. Perhaps he would wait until the raiders had been dealt with. Or perhaps he would send him and his knights out on a mission. Both would be the more rational choice. But most likely, Keith would attempt to sneak out himself, to go help his sister. It wasn't the captain's place to question the decision. To protect someone wasn't to hold them prisoner. The armor let him do and go wherever he pleased after all, even if he walked into his own doom. Destiny was rarely forgiving. He closed the water bottle, stood up, and went back into the training field. When the boy inevitably made the attempt, Captain Zagreus would make sure his knights would be there with him, packed and ready to follow.